Before the sun rose, Harold sat in the same booth at the corner diner and watched the steam lift from a mug of coffee. The place had a steady quiet that held even when the kitchen clattered. A cook moved behind the counter, in the practiced way of someone who had done the same small motions for years. Harold kept his hands folded on the table, palms down, as if to keep them from wandering toward a list that did not exist. He was 71 now. For most of his life, attention had been a tool. It went where it was needed and nowhere else. At work, it went to schedules, invoices, deliveries, and a narrow strip of daylight that could be spent or wasted. At home, it went to repairs and errands and the steady accounting of what still had to get done. Even at rest, his mind had kept a finger on the next task. That morning, there was no task waiting. The day was open in a way that once would have felt like danger. Harold turned his gaze to the window and to the faint reflection of his face in the glass. The diner lights made his features softer, less sharp than the man he used to be. He did not read this as loss. It was simply evidence that a long season had passed. A woman came in and took the stool at the end of the counter. She greeted the cook with a nod, and the cook nodded back. No names were used. The recognition was enough. A second customer arrived and held the door for her. The door closed with a soft seal that kept out the cold. Harold watched these small exchanges and felt a quiet sense of order. The moment held no accomplishment. It held belonging. His wife had died 3 years earlier. In the first months after, Harold had kept moving as if motion could keep the house from echoing. He had organized papers, cleaned the garage, sorted tools by size, and walked through rooms with nothing in his hands. He had repaired a loose stair tread that had not bothered anyone in 20 years. He had washed the inside of windows even though the light still came through the same. It had taken time to notice that the best hours of their life had not been the impressive ones. They had been the plain hours, when she stood at the sink and hummed to herself, when he carried groceries in and she made room on the counter, when they sat on the porch and listened to a distant lawnmower turn into silence. On weekends, she sometimes read at the table while he sharpened a kitchen knife. Their attention had been near each other without needing to touch. He finished his coffee slowly. He did not hurry the last sip. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past and the sound faded. Harold stood, left cash on the table, and put on his coat. He walked to his car and paused with his hand on the door. In the thin morning air, the pause felt like part of the day rather than a delay. At home, he stepped into the kitchen and set his keys in the same bowl by the door. The house was still. The refrigerator made a low, steady sound. On the counter, a stack of mail sat in a neat line, as if it had waited for him to give it meaning. He made no move toward it. Instead, he opened a drawer and took out a photo album with a cracked spine. He did not flip quickly, the way he once skimmed through anything that was not urgent. He turned each page and looked long enough to see the small background details. A chair in the corner, a calendar on the wall, a coat hanging from a hook. Later that morning, his daughter called. The call was brief and ordinary. She had a question about a recipe. Harold listened and gave the steps as he remembered them. Not perfectly, but close enough. When the call ended, the quiet returned without feeling like emptiness. It felt like a room that had been aired out. In later years, the worth of a day often showed itself in what attention returned to when nothing demanded it. Some minutes asked for effort and repaid it in pride. Other minutes asked only for presence and repaid it in quiet steadiness. This episode follows that shift, the slow recognition of which moments carried weight and which ones only looked important from a distance. Harold drove to the hardware store in the afternoon for a box of light bulbs. He did not rush through the aisles. At the counter, he waited while an older man counted change carefully. The waiting felt like part of the purchase, not a problem to be solved. When Harold got back to his car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. The day continued, simple and complete. Irene kept a small notebook in the side pocket of her purse. In her 30s, it had been full of lists, written tight and crowded, the lines used up as if paper was expensive. In her 60s, it held fewer words. It held reminders of the kind that did not push her forward. It held the names of trees she wanted to learn, the day a neighbor planned to bring over soup, and a note to take the long route home when the light was mild. On a weekday afternoon, she sat in a public library and watched dust drift in a shaft of sun. The building had the smell of paper and floor polish. A child moved between shelves with a slow seriousness, pulling out a book and pressing it open on the carpet. A man at a nearby table traced a finger along a map, pausing as if the lines were also memories. Irene looked up, then looked down again, letting the moment pass without turning it into something. She had worked for years as a coordinator in an office that valued speed. Her calendar had been a wall of blocks. Her attention had lived inside screens. The work itself was not wrong. It paid bills and kept routines stable. Still, in memory, the hours did not hold shape. The days blurred into each other, a long row of urgent tasks that did not ask to be remembered. After she retired, she expected relief to arrive like clear weather. Instead, she felt a mild disorientation, as if someone had removed the frame around her day. For months, she filled the empty spaces the only way she knew. She signed up for committees. She bought organizers for a desk that no longer mattered. She made elaborate plans for errands. None of it was painful. None of it felt true. The shift began with her sister. The sister lived across town and needed a ride to a clinic appointment once a month. The drive took 30 minutes each way. Irene had expected the trips to feel like obligations. They did not. They became a small ritual. Irene waited in the car while her sister came out to the porch, locked the door, and stepped down carefully. Irene noticed things she had not noticed before. The way her sister paused to check the sky. The way she set a hand on the railing as if greeting the day. They rarely spoke about anything dramatic. They spoke about a new show, a neighbor's dog, the taste of a bakery bread, the price of oranges. Irene kept expecting the conversation to need a point. It did not. The ride had the shape of care, and the minutes did not feel wasted. At stoplights, they watched other cars creep forward and settle again. They watched a bicyclist roll past in a bright jacket. The attention went to ordinary motion, and the mind did not demand more. After the appointment, they sometimes stopped for coffee. Irene watched her sister stir sugar into a cup and look out the window as if she were listening to something inside herself. Irene did not interrupt the silence. She let it be, then asked if the coffee tasted decent. Her sister nodded. The nod was enough. The day did not have to become a story to be worth holding. Back at the library, Irene turned a page and found herself lingering on a paragraph for reasons she could not name. She liked the sound of the words. She liked the calm of being unneeded for a short stretch. A librarian walked by with a cart of returns, and the wheels made a soft rhythmic sound. The noise reminded Irene of summer evenings when her mother folded laundry at the table. The television stayed low. The air conditioner clicked on and off. No one tried to make the moment important. In later years, Attention often stopped chasing the loudest thing in the room. It began to lean toward whatever felt steady and unforced. Some hours turned out to be empty, even when they were full. Some hours turned out to be full, even when they held very little. Irene left the library with no need to prove that the day had been used well. She walked slowly and let the light decide the pace. Outside, the sidewalk was damp from a brief rain. Irene crossed slowly, feeling the air cool on her cheeks. She did not reach for her phone. She walked past a line of trees and stopped at one with a bark pattern like shallow waves. She took out her notebook and wrote 2 words: rough bark. It was not a duty. It was a way of staying with the day. At home, she put the book back on the shelf and rinsed a cup in the sink. Her neighbor knocked softly and set a container of soup on the counter, still warm. They spoke for a few minutes about nothing in particular. When the door closed, Irene ate the soup at the table and watched the last of the daylight fade from the window. The attention stayed close, steady, and quiet. Samuel kept his watch even after he stopped needing it. The band had been replaced twice, and the glass carried a thin scratch that caught the light. For 30 years, time had been the thing that held his work together. He had measured it in minutes until arrival, minutes to stabilize, minutes to turn onto the next street. He had learned to read a clock without looking directly at it, as if time might move faster when stared at. He used to come home late and leave his shoes by the door. The soles carried grit and salt from winter roads. He washed his hands longer than most people, not out of fear, but out of habit. His wife kept dinner warm in the oven and waited without complaint. Some nights Samuel ate quickly and fell asleep in a chair with the television low. Other nights he stayed awake, watching the ceiling, hearing the echo of sirens in his head. Even in those hours, attention stayed busy. It searched for the next signal. In retirement, the watch still sat on his wrist. The face still ticked. The sound was small, but he heard it in quiet rooms. At first, it made him restless. It suggested that something was late. It suggested that the day should be shaped into a sequence of tasks. Samuel tried to oblige it. He filled his mornings with errands. He cleaned the garage. He organized tools into neat rows. He took on small repairs for neighbors and finished them quickly. The old habit of urgency still lit in his body. His wife watched him with a steady patience. She had her own routines, folding laundry in clean squares, tending a few plants on the porch, making coffee at the same hour. When Samuel rushed from one task to the next, she did not correct him. She simply left small openings in the day. A chair pulled out at the table, a slice of fruit set aside, a newspaper folded to the page that might interest him. Samuel saw those openings and passed them by. The change came in a kitchen that was not his. His daughter's kitchen was narrower, bright with a window over the sink. A bowl of fruit sat on the counter, and a child's shoe lay by the back door. Samuel had come to watch his grandson for an afternoon while his daughter ran out for an appointment. The grandson was 5 and had the slow patience of someone learning how the world fit together. They sat at the table with a box of wooden blocks. Samuel began by stacking the blocks into tidy towers, making them stable and efficient. The child took one block, turned it over, looked at the grain, and placed it sideways. The tower wobbled. Samuel reached to fix it. The child held up a hand. Not in refusal, but in focus. Samuel paused. For the next hour, the blocks became a city. The child made a bridge that could not hold. He made a roof that slid off. He made a road that ended in the middle of the table. Each failure was treated as information, not as a problem. Samuel watched. and something in him loosened. The watch still ticked, but the sound no longer demanded a response. When the city was finished, the child sat back and stared at it as if waiting for it to speak. Samuel stared too. The room was quiet except for the refrigerator and the small sounds of the house settling. Samuel noticed the smell of soap on his hands. He noticed a smudge of jam on the child's cheek. He noticed that nothing urgent was happening and that his body did not need to brace for it. Later, his daughter returned and thanked him. Samuel nodded and gathered his coat. At the door, the grandson handed him a single block and then turned away, already absorbed by something else. Samuel put the block in his pocket without thinking. It felt like a receipt for a kind of time that could not be logged. That evening at home, Samuel took the block out and set it on the table. His wife looked at it, then at him, and her face softened with recognition of something she had been waiting to see. Samuel made tea and stood at the window with his hands around the warm cup. Outside, the porch plants shifted slightly in a light breeze. His wife watered them slowly, pausing to pick off a dry leaf. Samuel did not reach for another task. He stayed where he was and watched. In later years, the hours that once seemed most valuable often turned out to be the ones that carried no visible result. Attention trained for speed began to recognize slowness as its own form of value. Samuel went to bed with the watch still on his wrist, but the ticking sounded less like a warning and more like a quiet companion. It kept time without taking it. Nora used to keep the television on for company, not loud, just present, a low hum that filled the corners of the room. When she retired, the days stretched and the silence felt too clean, like a house after guests had left. She tried to fill it the way she had filled workdays, with background noise, with news, with constant checking. Her phone became a small, restless weight in her hand. She was 64, with a careful way of doing things. She washed dishes as she cooked, stacked mail in neat piles, wiped the counter twice. Her husband moved at a slower pace. He read the paper in the same chair, took evening walks, and tended to hinges and latches around the house, as if the home were a small machine that deserved attention. Their marriage had always been built on gentle steadiness rather than intensity. It held through decades of ordinary days. For years, Nora had worked in a school office. Her attention had been a crowded hallway. It went to ringing phones, missing forms, a child who had forgotten a lunch, a teacher who needed a copy made in 5 minutes. She was good at it. People relied on her calm. The work gave her a sense of being necessary, which is a kind of shelter. When the job ended, the necessity ended too, and the mind reached for a substitute. At first, Nora filled the new space with projects. She cleaned closets. She labeled plastic bins. She reorganized the pantry as if food could be improved by order alone. When those tasks ran out, she filled the gaps with the phone in short increments. A minute at the sink, 2 minutes waiting for the kettle, 10 minutes on the couch before dinner. The minutes linked together without resistance. The content changed and changed again. At the end of an hour, she rarely remembered what she had looked at. The time left no trace except a mild fatigue in her eyes and a faint impatience with her own stillness. The first break came on a Saturday when her niece visited with a toddler. The toddler walked unsteadily through the living room and reached for everything. Nora put her phone in a drawer without thinking, as if her hands had remembered an older rule. She sat on the floor and rolled a small ball back and forth. The toddler laughed, then crawled after it, then fell over in delighted surprise. Nora laughed too, soft and surprised by her own sound. She felt the warmth of the carpet through her jeans. She noticed the toddler's small palm pressing onto her knee for balance. Attention tightened into a single point and stayed there. When the niece left, the house went quiet again. Nora opened the drawer and held the phone. The screen lit up. The familiar pull arrived. She could feel the mind leaning toward it, the way a body leans toward sugar. Nora set the phone down and walked into the kitchen instead. Her husband was making tea. He set out 2 mugs, the same mugs they had used for years, one with a small chip on the rim that no one bothered to replace. They sat at the table and drank without speaking much. The window showed a thin band of evening light. A neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. Nora watched the steam rise and felt her breathing slow to match it. She noticed the way her husband's hands wrapped around the mug, the steadiness of them. She noticed that her own mind, when not being fed constant fragments, began to settle into a slower attention that felt like rest rather than emptiness. After tea, her husband washed the mugs and left them upside down on a towel. Nora dried the table with a slow wipe. They stepped onto the porch for a few minutes and watched a streetlight come on. A car passed, and its headlights moved across the wall like a brief tide. Nothing needed to be captured or shared. The moment did not ask for proof. In the weeks that followed, Nora did not make a rule out of it. She did not set timers. She simply began to notice which minutes left her feeling thin and which ones left her feeling quietly full. She pulled out a box of old photographs and sorted them, not quickly, letting each image call up a room, a season, a texture. She wrote a short letter to a cousin she had not spoken to in years and mailed it without expecting anything back. She baked bread and watched the dough rise, patient with the slow change. In later years, time often revealed its value through the state it left behind. Some minutes scattered attention into pieces and asked for more. Other minutes gathered attention back into a single steady place. Nora still used her phone. She still watched television, but she learned to hear the difference between being filled and being occupied, and she began to choose the quieter kind of fullness more often. Luis had built his life in straight lines. Not in the sense that it was easy, but in the way a day could be measured by what got finished. He framed houses for decades, then supervised crews, then moved into smaller repair work as his knees stiffened. Wood made sense to him. It had grain and resistance and a clear answer to effort. At 58, he still rose before dawn. He still drank coffee standing at the counter. The old habit of moving fast sat in his shoulders even on days when no one was waiting. He carried a phone in his pocket, and the phone carried calendars, photos, weather, and messages that arrived with small, urgent sounds. Luis answered quickly. He had spent a lifetime being the person who did not let things drop. His son was 29 and worked in a different world, with screens and meetings. They spoke a few times a week, usually about practical things. Luis kept meaning to ask more about his son's life, but the habit of doing pulled him away. When the son called, Luis often stayed half-turned toward a toolbox, ready to return to whatever needed finishing. The calls ended cleanly. Nothing was wrong. Something was missing. On a Monday in early spring, Luis drove to a small job across town. The work was simple, a porch railing that needed to be replaced. The house belonged to an older couple. The husband held the door open while Luis carried in tools. The wife stood in the kitchen and wiped her hands on a towel, watching with quiet interest. They offered coffee. Luis declined out of habit, eager to start. He worked steadily for 2 hours, cutting boards, setting posts, checking level. The old satisfaction came with each clean line. When the last screw went in, he stepped back. and felt the small pride of a job made solid. He began packing tools, already thinking about the next stop and the time on the clock. The husband asked if Luis could look at a gate that had been sticking. It was a small request. Luis almost refused. The schedule in his pocket rose up like a rule. Instead, he followed the husband into the backyard. The gate was old and slightly warped. Luis adjusted a hinge and planed a rough edge. The gate swung smoothly again. The husband stood there and watched the gate open and close, as if it had been a problem for weeks, and now it belonged to the past. The wife came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the patio table anyway. Luis picked it up and felt the heat through the paper cup. He drank slowly. He noticed a small vegetable garden by the fence. The soil turned and ready. The wife mentioned plans for herbs this year, simple plants that would be used in small meals. Luis listened. The minutes passed without a plan, and Luis did not feel them slipping away. When he returned to his truck, his phone showed a missed call from his son. Luis sat for a moment with his hand on the steering wheel and called back. His son answered quickly, then slowed when he heard Luis's voice. The conversation stayed ordinary. His son talked about a minor work problem. Luis listened without steering it back to tasks. When the call ended, Luis felt a quiet surprise. The time had held. On the drive to the next job, Luis found himself thinking about his own father. His father had taught him to use a saw, to measure twice, to keep tools clean. His father had also taken long pauses in the evening to sit on a step and watch light fade from the yard. Luis had once seen those pauses as laziness. Now he saw them as a kind of attention that kept life from becoming only labor. That night, after dinner, Luis went outside and sat on the front steps. The steps felt cool under him. His son called again, not because anything urgent was happening, but because the connection had begun to feel easy. Luis watched a moth circle the porch light and disappear. He listened to his son describe a new apartment, the way sunlight hit the floor in the morning, the neighbor who watered plants on the landing. Luis held the details carefully. He did not try to fix or improve them. He simply let them stand as they were. In later years, the measure of time shifted from output to presence. Work still mattered, and skill still mattered. But some of the most valuable minutes arrived in the spaces that were not scheduled. Luis finished the rest of his jobs that week. The part he remembered was the coffee on the patio, the gate swinging freely in the quiet air, and the sound of his son's voice settling into an unhurried rhythm. May kept a drawer full of small things that had once been useful. Rubber bands, paper clips, spare keys that no longer fit any lock. She did not throw them away because each object carried a memory of being prepared. Preparedness had been her style. It had kept her household steady through lean years, through job changes, through the slow work of raising children into adults. At 69, May lived alone in a modest apartment. Her husband had died years earlier. Her daughter lived across the state and visited when she could. Their connection stayed steady through short calls, holiday meals, and small packages mailed with care. May did not feel abandoned. She felt the ordinary distance of a life that had moved into its next stage. May had worked as an accountant. For decades, her attention had lived inside numbers. It had been a clean kind of focus, tight and reliable. Errors were visible. Corrections were possible. The work rewarded vigilance. When she retired, she expected the mind to relax. Instead, it kept searching for problems to solve. She began waking early and scanning the day for potential waste. She rearranged cupboards. She compared prices online. She read reviews of products she did not need. She tracked small expenses in a notebook, even though money was no longer tight. The feeling was not panic. It was a thin itch of unease. The sense that a day without improvement was a day misused. One afternoon, she met an old friend at a community center. The friend had invited her to a beginner ceramics class. May almost declined. She pictured the mess. She pictured the time. Then she pictured the friend standing there alone, hands in pockets, waiting in a hallway full of strangers. May went. The room smelled of damp clay. Tables were covered with plastic. A bucket of water sat at each station. May sat beside her friend and watched hands press clay into a bowl shape. May's first attempt collapsed. Her second attempt cracked along the rim. Her friend kept working with a quiet patience, not rushing to make something presentable. May found herself slowing down simply because the clay required it. There was no way to hurry it without ruining it. When the class ended, May and her friend walked outside into late afternoon light. The friend pointed out a small tree with new leaves. May looked, and for a moment the mind stopped auditing the hour. It simply saw the leaves catching sun. They walked to a small cafe and sat at a window table. May drank tea and watched people pass. The friend stirred a drink and smiled at nothing in particular. The minutes did not need to justify themselves. At home, May rinsed clay residue from under her nails and noticed the simple satisfaction of clean hands. She opened the drawer of prepared things and looked at the rubber bands. She felt a mild affection for the person who had saved them. She closed the drawer and left it alone. She made rice and vegetables and ate slowly. She watched a simple show on television and turned it off when she felt tired, not when an episode ended. Weeks later, her daughter came for a weekend visit. May cooked a familiar meal, the kind her daughter requested every time, and set the table carefully. The bowls May used were not perfect. They were ceramic bowls from the class, slightly uneven, with glaze that pooled darker near the rim. Her daughter noticed them and ran a finger gently along the edge, impressed without needing words. They ate and talked about ordinary plans. After dinner, they washed dishes together, passing plates hand to hand in a slow shared rhythm that felt older than the house itself. On Monday, after her daughter left, May went to the community center again. She and her friend stayed after class to sweep the floor and rinse tools. The work was simple. It required attention, but not the tight kind that gripped. May noticed that she was listening more, the scrape of broom bristles, the small laugh of someone at another table, the sound of water running into a bucket. The sounds did not add up to anything. They were enough. She carried a newly glazed bowl home in a paper bag and felt its steady weight. In later years, attention often began to trust that a day could be complete without being optimized. Some moments were worth keeping because they were efficient. Other moments were worth keeping because they softened the inner grip that efficiency demanded. May kept the drawer, and she kept her careful nature, but her attention learned to rest on the unmeasured parts of the day and stay there. Dana's calendar used to be a grid of obligation: shifts, overtime, trainings, birthdays, school events, repairs. The boxes were filled to the edge, and any empty space was treated as a mistake. Dana had learned early that time could slip away and leave trouble behind. The habit of staying ahead was not simply ambition, it was a way of feeling safe. At 61, Dana had been retired for 2 years. The body still carried the old alertness. A sudden sound outside could bring a lift of adrenaline. A siren in the distance could pull attention like a hook. Dana kept waking before dawn, even without an alarm, and lying still in the dark as if waiting for a call that would never come. Dana lived with a partner in a small house that had been paid off long ago. The partner moved quietly in the mornings, making coffee and opening blinds one by one. The house had a gentle rhythm now. It asked for less. Dana did not know what to do with that at first. The mind reached for purpose and found only quiet. For a while, Dana tried to turn retirement into another job. The garage was cleaned twice. The basement shelves were rearranged. Old files were sorted into folders with careful labels. Dana volunteered for a local organization and took on too much. The old pattern of being indispensable returning without resistance. Dana answered emails quickly. Dana arrived early. Dana stayed late. The work was useful, but the tiredness at night felt familiar and misplaced. The change began on a morning when rain came down steadily and cancelled plans. Dana stood at the window and watched water run off the gutters. The partner set a mug of coffee on the table and sat across with a book. There was nothing to respond to. There was no decision to make. Dana felt a twitch of unease, then a slow loosening. Dana picked up an old photo album and opened it. The pages held images from decades earlier, some faded, some too bright from flash. There were pictures of children in a yard, of a kitchen table crowded with plates, of faces at a holiday gathering. Dana noticed that the strongest memories were not attached to big events. They were attached to a smell in a hallway, to a hand on a shoulder, to light through a window at the end of a day. The partner watched Dana turn pages without speaking. Dana did not need words. The room was quiet enough to hear the rain and the refrigerator. Dana stayed with the images, letting each one take the time it required. A picture of a child holding a bicycle handlebar made Dana pause longer than expected. The child was grown now. The child had a job, an apartment, and a life that moved at its own speed. Dana had spent years trying to protect that child by staying busy. The protection had been sincere. The time had also taken on a hard shine, as if busyness could polish worry into control. Looking at the picture, Dana saw the cost, not in dramatic loss, but in missed ease. That afternoon, the phone rang. It was the grown child calling during a break at work. The call lasted 10 minutes. Dana listened to small details about a coworker, a lunch, a new route home. Dana noticed that the voice on the line sounded more relaxed when Dana was not rushing. The call ended, and the house was quiet again. But the quiet did not feel like absence. It felt like space after something good. On Saturday, a grandchild came to visit with Dana's child. The grandchild was 7 and carried a small paper bag of craft supplies. Dana and the grandchild sat at the dining table and folded paper into simple shapes. The grandchild concentrated hard, tongue pressed lightly against a lip. Dana watched the small hands crease and smooth. The partner brought out a plate of sliced fruit and set it down with a gentle tap, careful not to break the grandchild's focus. When the grandchild finally held up a finished paper bird, Dana felt a surprising rush of pride, not in an achievement, but in the shared time that had made the bird possible. The paper bird was flimsy and uneven. It would not last. The minute would. Later, Dana and the partner took a slow walk down the street. The sidewalks were wet. A few leaves clung to the curb. Dana noticed the way the partner paused to look at a bird on a fence. And Dana paused too. The time did not feel like waiting. It felt like joining. In later years, attention often stopped treating quiet as a gap to be filled. It began to treat quiet as a place where meaning could settle. Dana still volunteered, but with fewer commitments. Dana still kept a calendar, but with more empty boxes. The minutes that lingered were the ones spent in the ordinary presence of another person, with rain on the window, a photo album open, and a paper bird drying on the table. Anita used to measure a day by how many errands fit inside it. She planned routes like a dispatcher, grouping tasks by distance and parking options. Even grocery shopping had a strategy. The habit came from years of raising children while working full-time. Efficiency had been necessary. It had kept the household from unraveling. At 66, Anita had fewer demands. Her children were grown and busy. A grandson visited on weekends. Her husband still worked part-time, mostly out of habit and pride. The house was quieter now. Anita found herself filling the quiet with motion, as if stillness might invite something heavy. On Tuesday mornings, she visited her sister, who lived in a small apartment nearby. The sister's knees were unreliable, and stairs were slow. Anita brought groceries and carried laundry to the basement. She moved through the tasks quickly, hands practiced, mind already on the next item. Her sister watched from a chair by the window, patient and calm. One morning, as Anita folded towels, she noticed her sister watching a patch of sunlight on the wall. The sunlight moved slowly as clouds passed. The sister's face looked softer in that light, less tense. Anita felt a small irritation at first, a reflex against stillness. Then she realized her sister was not waiting to be entertained. She was simply resting inside the hour. Anita finished folding and sat down. The chair felt unfamiliar under her, as if sitting was a new skill. The sister reached for a small photo on a side table and held it in her lap. It showed the two of them as teenagers, hair pinned back, standing in front of a car that no longer existed. Anita studied the photo longer than expected. She remembered the heat of that day and the rough feel of the driveway under bare feet. She remembered laughing until her stomach hurt, not because anything clever happened, but because the day itself felt wide. The sister set the photo back down and turned her gaze to the window again. Outside, a man walked a dog slowly. The dog stopped to sniff the base of a tree, then moved on. Anita watched too. In the pause, the mind did not collapse. It did not lose its edge. It simply stopped running. Later, Anita drove home and passed a park. She would normally keep driving. She pulled in and parked instead. She sat on a bench and watched a few people move along a path. A jogger passed. A woman pushed a stroller. A child walked behind, dragging a stick through gravel. Anita noticed the sound the stick made, a slow scrape that became a pattern. The pattern held her attention the way a song might hold it. On Saturday, the grandson arrived with a small backpack and a toy car in his hand. Anita had planned the day in advance. A store run, a quick stop for supplies, a meal that could be cooked in bulk. The grandson walked into the living room and sat on the floor without hurry. He pushed the toy car along the baseboard, stopping it at each corner as if the corners were stations. Anita hovered in the doorway, still thinking about the list. Then she sat down on the carpet. The carpet smelled faintly of clean laundry. The grandson looked up, then returned to the car, offering it to Anita with a brief, serious glance. Anita rolled it back. The car tapped her palm with a light plastic sound. They repeated the motion until it became a game, simple and absorbing. Later, they walked to the park with a small bag of snacks. The grandson crouched to watch ants cross a crack in the sidewalk. Anita waited, then crouched too. The ants carried tiny pieces of leaf, moving with purpose that did not need explanation. The grandson stood and took Anita's hand. They crossed the street together, and Anita noticed how small the hand felt, warm and trusting. That evening, when the grandson fell asleep on the couch under a blanket, Anita turned off the television and left the room dim. She sat in a chair nearby and listened to the quiet sounds of sleep. The minutes did not feel empty. They felt like a house settling into its most gentle state. When her husband got home, Anita did not rush into dinner preparations. She set a pot of water to boil and then stood at the sink and watched steam rise. Her husband sat at the table and read. The two of them were in the same room without needing to fill it with talk. The small shared presence felt like the kind of time that had always been available, even during the busiest years, and yet had often been overlooked. In later years, some people found that attention stopped obeying the loudest demands. It began to return to small scenes that asked for nothing and gave a quiet sense of being alive. Anita still ran errands. She still made lists. But she began to leave space for moments that could not be optimized, and she began to recognize them as time well spent. Owen kept a small stack of business cards in a drawer, even though the job was long over. The edges were worn, and the phone number printed on them belonged to a line that had been disconnected. The cards were relics of a life where attention had been directed outward, toward clients, toward targets, toward a constant need to be convincing. In his working years, Owen had been good at staying in motion. He drove to meetings, ate lunch in his car, and returned calls while walking through parking lots. At home, he stayed half-turned toward the next thing. He loved his wife, and he loved his children. But love had been braided into a schedule. When his wife talked about her day, Owen listened while also scanning emails. He did not mean to be distant. He had simply trained attention to split. At 68, after a minor health scare and a quiet retirement, Owen found himself with hours that did not have names. The first months felt like a vacation that would not end. Then the days began to feel flat. Owen tried to solve the flatness the only way he knew. He took on projects. He organized the shed. He tracked news and market updates as if the information would protect him from aging. The mind stayed busy, but the body felt strangely tired. One evening, an old friend called. The friend had once worked beside Owen, then moved away, then returned to town years later. The friend suggested meeting at a small pier at dawn, not to fish seriously, but to sit and watch the water. Owen almost declined. Dawn felt early for a retired man. Then he agreed, surprising himself. The next morning, Owen drove in silence. The streets were dim. The pier was empty except for a few birds, and the friend sitting on a bench. The friend had brought 2 cups of coffee and a small bag of pastries. Owen sat beside him. They ate and watched the water change color as the light rose. They spoke only occasionally, and even then the words were simple, about a neighbor, a familiar street, a memory of a job that had once felt urgent. The friend pointed toward the far edge of the water where a boat moved slowly. Owen followed the gesture and felt his attention settle into the distance. The mind did not demand commentary. It did not need to be right about anything. It simply stayed with the sight of the boat sliding forward and the small wake behind it. The pier had its own sounds. A rope tapped against a post. Water lapped in a slow rhythm. A gull landed and folded its wings with an awkward dignity. Owen noticed that his body was warmer than usual, not from effort, but from the simple act of being outside at a quiet hour. The friend took a bite of pastry and brushed crumbs from his palm. The motion was ordinary, almost invisible. Owen realized that these were the motions he rarely noticed when he spent years racing from place to place. As the light climbed, the friend mentioned a small loss from the previous year, a death in the family, a house emptied, a closet cleaned out. The details were offered without drama. Owen listened without trying to fix anything. He noticed that listening, when it was not paired with an agenda, could feel like work of the best kind. It asked for attention and gave connection. When Owen got home, his wife was awake. She stood in the kitchen and cut fruit into a bowl. Owen kissed her cheek and sat at the table. He told her about the pier in a few sentences. She listened and looked pleased, not because the story was exciting, but because Owen's eyes looked different. He was present in his own morning. Over the next weeks, Owen returned to the pier with the friends several times. Sometimes they spoke more. Sometimes they watched in silence. The time did not produce anything. It did not add money or status or progress. It did something quieter. It returned Owen to himself, and it returned him to his marriage in small ways, with slower meals and longer pauses before reaching for a screen. On a Sunday afternoon, Owen's daughter brought her children over for dinner. Owen noticed how quickly he used to hurry these evenings, cleaning plates too soon, pushing conversation toward plans. This time he stayed seated longer. He watched a grandchild line up crackers on a plate with careful precision. He watched his wife laugh quietly at something small. The evening passed without being packed tight, and Owen felt the satisfaction of a full day that had not been used up. In later years, some people discovered that the most valuable attention was the kind that did not need to persuade or perform. It could rest on a simple scene, shared with another person, and feel complete. Owen kept the old business cards in the drawer. They no longer described his life. The mornings on the pier did. Patrice had spent years giving attention away. She did it in small portions, like coins, throughout the day. At work, she gave it to patients and paperwork and the steady flow of requests. At home, she gave it to children, to an aging parent, to a partner who needed reassurance after long hours. Patrice learned to live with her attention divided. She became skilled at listening while doing something else. She became skilled at being useful. In her 40s, when the children were still in school, Patrice's evenings were a blur of small demands. A permission slip, a lost shoe, a school email, a sink full of dishes. Patrice handled it with a competence that looked like calm from the outside. Inside, her attention rarely rested. Even on the couch, even with a show on, her mind stayed half raised, waiting for the next need to appear. She used to fall asleep with her phone on the armrest, not from interest, but from habit. At 63, Patrice stepped back from full-time work. The decision was practical, made after her mother's mobility declined. Patrice moved her mother into a small bedroom on the first floor and placed a comfortable chair near a window. The window faced a yard with shrubs and a narrow strip of sky. Patrice worried at first that her mother would feel trapped. Her mother did not complain. She simply watched light shift and waited for meals and visits, letting the day arrive as it was. Patrice made routines as a form of care, morning medications with a glass of water, breakfast at the same hour, laundry on Tuesdays, a short walk to the mailbox when weather allowed. The tasks were not heavy individually, but together they filled the day. Patrice looked up one afternoon and realized she had been moving for 6 hours without sitting down. Hands busy, mind busy, heart slightly tight. That was when she noticed her mother's hands. Her mother sat in the chair and folded a washcloth slowly, smoothing the corners with thumb and forefinger as if the cloth deserved respect. Patrice watched and felt a sudden tenderness. The hands were smaller than they used to be. The skin was thin. The motion was patient. Patrice sat on the edge of the sofa and folded towels from the dryer. At first she folded quickly, eager to finish and return to the next task. Then she matched her mother's pace without deciding to. The room was quiet except for the dryer clicking and the soft sound of fabric being smoothed. Patrice noticed the smell of clean cotton. She noticed the afternoon light on the floor. She noticed that in this slow work, there was no urgency and no disappointment. Her mother looked up and watched Patrice work. The look held a quiet gratitude that did not beg for anything. Patrice felt something settle in her chest, a feeling she had not known she missed. The tasks were still tasks, but the attention inside them felt different. It was not being spent like coins. It was being placed gently, as if it might return. In the weeks that followed, Patrice began to build small islands of unhurried time inside the day. She made tea and drank it at the table instead of carrying it from room to room. She sat outside for 10 minutes after watering plants and let her mind drift. A friend called and asked if Patrice wanted to meet for lunch. Patrice almost refused out of habit. Then she accepted and arranged for a neighbor to sit with her mother for an hour. At the cafe, Patrice and the friend ate soup and bread. The conversation moved from ordinary things to older memories. Patrice laughed in a way that surprised her. When the lunch ended, Patrice walked slowly back to the car, noticing the sound of traffic and the feel of sun on her face. Nothing in the afternoon had been accomplished in a visible way. Patrice felt lighter anyway. That evening, an adult child stopped by with groceries. The child carried bags into the kitchen and checked a loose porch step without being asked. Patrice watched from the doorway and felt a quiet recognition of continuity, the life she had built moving on with new hands. Later, Patrice found her mother asleep in the chair, head tilted slightly. Patrice covered her with a blanket and stood for a moment watching her breathe, letting the stillness last. In later years, time well spent was not always time spent doing more. It could be time spent giving attention to what was already there. The hands folding cloth, the light on a floor, the quiet company of someone loved. Patrice still had responsibilities. The day still asked for effort, but she began to recognize the difference between attention that was drained away and attention that returned, restored, and calm. Claire kept a pair of reading glasses in every room, not because she owned many pairs, but because she kept misplacing the same pair and buying another. By 62, she had stopped judging herself for it. She simply accepted that her attention had learned a new shape, one that did not stay pinned to a single object the way it used to. She and her husband, Mark, had been married for 38 years. They were not dramatic people. Their life had been built out of steady routines, early work mornings, grocery lists, a house that needed small fixes, and holidays that arrived whether they were ready or not. When their children were younger, the weekends were full of driving and planning. Claire used to believe the busy years were the meaningful ones, because they looked important on a calendar. After the children left home, the calendar thinned. Mark still worked, but from home more often now. Claire retired from a job that had been loud and constant. The first months of retirement felt like a door opening. Then the openness began to feel like an accusation. Claire filled it with errands she did not need and projects that did not matter. She cleaned cabinets, repainted a hallway, and rearranged a closet as if the order of hangers could restore a feeling she could not name. On a cold Sunday, Mark suggested they drive to a small bakery across town. Claire almost refused. She was wearing comfortable clothes. The day had no plan. Then she said yes, and they left in the late morning light. The kind that makes even familiar streets look different. They parked, went inside, and stood in line behind a father holding a sleepy child. Mark read the menu slowly. Claire watched the child's head rest against the father's shoulder. She watched the father sway slightly, not to hurry the line, but to keep the child settled. The movement was small and patient. Claire felt a quiet sting of recognition. Years ago, she and Mark had moved like that without noticing. They sat by the window with coffee and warm bread. Mark broke off a piece and set it on Claire's plate, the same small habit he had done for decades without thinking. Claire looked at his hands, older hands now, with faint scars from home repairs and work. She realized she could not recall the last time she had simply watched him do something ordinary without rushing past it. They talked about nothing urgent, a neighbor's new fence, a show they might watch, the weather for the week. Then Mark fell quiet, looking out the window at people passing on the sidewalk. Claire followed his gaze and let the quiet stay. The minutes felt full without being busy. When they drove home, Mark took the longer route along a river. The water moved dark and slow. Claire rested her hand on the center console, close enough to Mark without needing to touch. She noticed her breathing had slowed. She noticed the way the car's heater hummed. She noticed that her mind was not scanning for the next task. Back at home, they carried the paper bag into the kitchen. Mark set the remaining bread on a plate and covered it loosely, as if saving something small mattered. Claire put the kettle on and stood beside him at the counter. They did not talk much. They were simply there, in the same room, letting the day be plain. Later that evening, Claire found her reading glasses on the windowsill where she had left them. She smiled and put them on, then took them off again, amused by the tiny problem that had once irritated her. The day had not been used for progress. It had been used for presence, and it left a calm behind it. Over time, Claire began to recognize that some of the best hours were the ones that did not announce themselves. They were quiet hours shared. A small meal, a longer drive, a hand set near another hand. The worth of those minutes did not depend on what they produced. It depended on what they allowed her attention to notice. On Monday, their daughter called during a lunch break. The call was short. She asked if they still had the old casserole dish and laughed when Claire described where it was stored. Mark listened from the other side of the table, smiling at the sound. After the call ended, Claire noticed that the warmth in the room came less from the heater than from the easy, ordinary connection that had not been scheduled. In later years, the hours that stayed in memory were often not the busy ones. They were the ones where attention finally had room to rest on what was already good and to see it clearly. Ravi kept his father's old pocket knife in a wooden bowl on the dresser. The knife was small, with a worn handle and a blade that still held an edge. Ravi did not use it much. He kept it where he could see it. The sight of it reminded him of a kind of time that was hard to measure. Time spent beside someone who did not speak much, but stayed close. Ravi was 56 and had spent most of his adulthood working long hours. He liked the feeling of being needed. He liked the clean certainty of a finished task. When his children were young, he had promised himself he would do everything right. He would provide. He would fix what needed fixing. He would keep the family safe from the kinds of worry he remembered from childhood. His wife, Lena, had been the steadier one. She held routines without making a show of it. She remembered birthdays, kept a small garden, and stayed patient when Ravi's mind wandered toward work. Lena did not scold him. She simply kept inviting him back into the room. A chair pulled out at dinner. A walk suggested after dishes. a quiet question asked without urgency. Then Ravi's father became ill. It was not sudden. The illness arrived in small changes. Slower steps, longer naps, a hand on the wall when walking down a hallway. Ravi began driving to his father's apartment twice a week. He brought groceries, checked the sink for leaks, and replaced light bulbs. He treated the visits like errands, efficient and controlled. One afternoon, as Ravi stood on a chair changing a bulb, his father spoke from the couch. He did not ask for more help. He asked if Ravi remembered the day they went fishing at a pond outside town. Ravi did remember, but only as a blurred scene. A sun glare on water, the smell of wet grass, the awkward silence between them. Ravi answered quickly, ready to return to the task. His father shook his head slowly and smiled. He said it was not the fish that mattered. It was how long they sat there, saying almost nothing, listening to the water and the insects. Ravi climbed down and sat in the armchair across from him. The new bulb cast a warm light. The room looked softer than Ravi expected. They talked for an hour, not about big topics, but about small, practical memories. A broken bicycle chain that took 2 hours to fix. A winter storm that knocked out power. A neighbor who brought soup without being asked. Ravi noticed that his father's eyes brightened when the memory included another person, another hand, another ordinary kindness. When Ravi left, he felt a strange tenderness and a faint regret. He had done many useful things in his life. He had also hurried through some of the only minutes that could not be replaced. On the drive home, he did not turn on the radio. He let the road noise fill the car and kept his attention on the quiet. At home, Lena was chopping vegetables for dinner. Ravi stood beside her and offered to help. He did not say why. He simply stayed. They cooked together, passing a cutting board back and forth, tasting a sauce, laughing at a small mistake. Their children arrived later for an early meal and told stories about work and school. Ravi listened without checking his phone. He noticed the way Lena leaned her shoulder lightly against his for a moment as she reached for plates. A week later, Ravi brought his father to a park on a mild afternoon. They sat on a bench and watched a few dogs run on wet grass. Ravi's father did not talk much. Ravi did not force conversation. He watched his father's hands resting on his knees, the thin skin, the calm. The minutes did not feel productive. They felt right. In later years, Ravi began to understand that time well spent was often time spent without improvement. It was the quiet, shared time that taught attention to stop chasing the next task and to notice the people who had been there all along. After his father died months later, Ravi cleaned out the apartment slowly, not in the efficient way he once would have. He found the pocket knife in a drawer wrapped in a cloth. He sat on the floor and held it for a long time, remembering the quiet pond and the sound of water against a bank. When Lena came in and sat beside him, Ravi leaned his head lightly against her shoulder. The moment did not fix anything. It softened something. Some minutes pass and disappear. Other minutes, especially the unhurried ones, leave a small, steady mark. They teach the mind what to return to when the noise quiets. Ravi kept the knife where he could see it. Elaine volunteered at the animal shelter on Thursday mornings because it was the one commitment she never resented. She was 73, with a soft voice and a careful way of moving, and the dogs responded to her as if they could hear steadiness the way people hear it. Elaine's husband, Tom, drove her there and waited in the car with a newspaper. He liked the routine. He liked the small predictability of dropping her off, circling the parking lot once, then settling into a space near the entrance. Elaine teased him about it, and he smiled without defending himself. Their marriage had always been made of small agreements, the kind that do not get announced. Elaine had spent much of her life caring for others. She raised 2 children, worked as a receptionist, and later cared for her mother through a slow decline. She was competent in the way that makes people lean on you. For years, her attention went outward. It watched for needs before they were spoken. After her mother died, Elaine expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt a peculiar hollowness. Not grief exactly, but the absence of constant purpose. She filled it with tidy tasks, wiping counters that were already clean, sorting drawers, rechecking locks at night. The mind kept searching for something to hold. At the shelter, a staff member handed her a leash and introduced a new dog, a thin brown mutt with a cautious stare. The dog's name was Jasper. He had been found wandering near a highway. He did not pull on the leash. He barely moved at all. Elaine knelt beside him and waited, letting the dog decide what the minute would become. She held out a hand without reaching. Jasper sniffed, then leaned his weight forward in a tentative way. Elaine stood slowly and began walking down the corridor. She did not speak much. She did not praise loudly. She moved at a pace that invited the dog to match her, and after a few steps, Jasper did. His tail did not wag. His eyes stayed wary. Still, he walked. Outside, the air was cold and clear. Elaine led Jasper along a small path behind the building. Tom watched from the car and lifted a hand in a small wave. Elaine waved back without breaking stride. Jasper looked toward Tom, then back at Elaine. They continued. Halfway down the path, Jasper stopped and stared at a patch of grass, as if the grass held a memory. Elaine stopped too. She waited without pulling. After a long moment, Jasper took a breath and stepped forward again. The moment felt like nothing from the outside. Just a woman standing with a dog. Inside it held something quiet and real. The practice of staying with what was uncertain without forcing it to hurry. When they returned, the staff member thanked Elaine. Elaine handed back the leash and rubbed Jasper's ears once, gently. Jasper leaned into her hand. It was a small trust, offered briefly. Elaine felt her chest loosen, as if her own attention had been held for a moment by something uncomplicated. On the drive home, Tom asked how it went. Elaine described Jasper in a few sentences. Tom listened, then turned down the radio, leaving space for quiet. At a stoplight, Tom reached over and touched Elaine's hand. The touch was brief, almost absent-minded. Elaine noticed it anyway. She noticed how many years had passed with hands finding each other in small ways, and how easy it was to miss those minutes when attention was always elsewhere. At home, Elaine made soup and let it simmer. She sat at the table with Tom and watched steam rise. The day did not need a highlight. The shelter walk, the stop moment in the grass, the brief hand touch in the car, all of it sat together like pieces of one ordinary hour. In later years, time well spent was often time spent offering attention without an agenda. A slow walk, a quiet wait, a hand held at a stoplight. These minutes did not look impressive, but they left behind a steadier kind of peace. On Sunday, their son stopped by with his teenage daughter. The girl hovered at the doorway with headphones half on, polite but distant. Elaine asked if she wanted to come along next Thursday and meet a few dogs. The girl shrugged, then said maybe. It was not enthusiasm, but it was a door not fully closed. Tom watched from the kitchen and raised his eyebrows as if to say it was enough. That evening, Elaine wrote Jasper's name on a small notepad by the phone, not as a task, but as a way of keeping the memory close. Later, she and Tom sat on the couch and listened to the house settle. The quiet felt lived in rather than empty, and the minute felt like it belonged to them. Walt still trimmed his hedges with a hand shear, even though a powered trimmer would have been easier. He liked the slow snip and the clean line. At 80, he moved carefully, and the work took longer. He did not mind. The yard had become a place where his attention could settle without being pulled. His neighbor, Rosa, was in her late 50s and lived 2 houses down with her sister. They waved to Walt most days. Sometimes Rosa brought him a container of food when she made too much. Walt never refused. He had learned that refusing small kindnesses did not make a person independent. It made a person alone. Walt's wife had died 6 years earlier. The first year after, Walt kept busy in the hard way, cleaning the garage, repainting the porch, reorganizing tools. People praised him for staying active. He accepted the praise and felt nothing from it. The work was not healing. It was a way of keeping his attention from landing on the wrong places. Then, one morning, Walt's car would not start. He stood in the driveway with the hood up, staring as if staring could fix it. Rosa walked over with her sister. They asked what was wrong. Walt shrugged and said the battery was old. Rosa's sister went back to her house and returned with jumper cables. The 3 of them stood in the driveway while the cars idled. Walt held the metal clamp in his hand and waited for instruction like a student. Rosa's sister connected the cables with practiced confidence. Rosa stood beside Walt and kept up a stream of light talk about the weather and a new restaurant in town. Walt listened and nodded. The car started. The problem was solved. What stayed with Walt was not the car starting. It was the way Rosa and her sister had come without hesitation, the way Rosa kept talking so the moment did not feel embarrassing, the way the small crisis became a shared, ordinary scene. Later that day, Walt drove to the store and bought a new battery. He installed it himself. He could still do that. The independence mattered less than he once believed. A few weeks later, Walt noticed Rosa carrying a heavy package up her steps. He walked over and lifted it for her. Rosa thanked him and invited him in for tea. Walt almost declined out of habit. Then he followed her into the kitchen. The house smelled like coffee and spices. Rosa's sister sat at the table sorting mail. They made room for Walt without making it a big deal. They drank tea and talked about nothing that would matter to anyone else. A neighborhood cat. A storm that knocked down a branch. A cousin who still told the same story at every gathering. Walt laughed more than he expected. When he left, he noticed the air felt warmer even though the day was cool. At home, Walt sat in his living room and looked at the chair where his wife used to sit. The chair was still there. The room still carried the shape of the life they had lived. Walt felt the usual ache, but he also felt something else. A small sense of being held by the neighborhood, by the simple fact of people nearby. On Saturday, Walt trimmed the hedges again. Rosa walked by and waved. Walt waved back and held up the shears as if showing his work. Rosa smiled and called out that the hedges looked sharp. Walt nodded, pleased, not because the hedges were impressive, but because someone had noticed. In later years, time well spent often arrived as small exchanges that made the day less solitary. A jump start, a cup of tea, a wave across a yard. Attention that used to chase big goals began to recognize the quiet value of being known and being useful in small ways. Walt's daughter visited the following month and brought a casserole in a foil pan. She stood in the kitchen and looked around the way adult children do, seeing both the present and the past at once. Walt started to talk about projects, a loose gutter, a window that stuck. His daughter listened, then asked him to sit down for a minute. Walt sat. The request felt simple, but it landed like a new rule. They ate at the table and talked about her work and her children, the minor stresses that filled her days. Walt listened without interrupting with solutions. He noticed that his attention, when it was not trying to fix something, became a softer kind of presence. His daughter's shoulders lowered as she spoke. After dinner, she washed dishes while Walt dried, moving at a shared pace that made the kitchen feel alive. When she left, she hugged him longer than usual. Walt stood in the doorway and watched her car back out. The street looked ordinary. The moment felt weighty anyway. It was not dramatic. It was simply time that had been given to each other without distraction. In later years, the minutes that mattered were often the ones that did not solve anything. They made space for connection to be felt, and they let attention land where it had always wanted to land. Jenna had been proud of her speed. In her 40s, she could move through a day like a machine, answering messages, handling meetings, squeezing groceries and errands into the spaces between calls. She told herself it was discipline. It was also fear. The fear of falling behind. The fear that quiet meant wasted time. At 55, Jenna ran a small office and still carried the same habit. Her phone was always within reach. Even at dinner, she kept it face down on the table, as if it might vibrate with something important. Her husband, Pete, tolerated it with a half smile. Their kids were older now, one in college and one working. The house was calmer. Jenna's mind was not. One Friday evening, Pete suggested they meet friends for an early dinner. Jenna agreed while also sending a last email. At the restaurant, the four of them sat in a corner booth. The conversation moved easily. Someone told a story about a work mishap. Someone laughed hard enough to wipe tears. Jenna smiled and nodded, but her attention kept slipping toward her phone. She checked it once under the table, then again, then felt slightly ashamed and checked it a third time anyway. Their friend Marla noticed and did not scold. She simply asked Jenna, quietly, if everything was okay. Jenna said yes. Marla nodded, then told a small story about her own mother, how her mother used to be busy every minute until retirement, and how the first thing she did after retiring was sit in a chair and stare out a window for hours. The family worried. The mother said she was finally catching up with her own life. The phrase stayed with Jenna. Catching up with her own life. Jenna looked around the table. Pete was listening, elbows on the booth, relaxed. Marla's husband was tearing bread into small pieces, smiling at the conversation. Jenna realized that everyone else was fully there, and she was only partly there, as if she were saving herself for a future that might never arrive. On the drive home, Jenna turned her phone off. The act felt risky, like stepping out without a coat. Pete noticed and said nothing at first. Then he reached over and rested his hand on Jenna's knee for a moment. A simple touch that carried more gratitude than words would have. Jenna kept her eyes on the road and felt her throat tighten. At home, they made tea and sat on the couch. The television stayed off. Jenna waited for restlessness to arrive. It did. A small itch in her hands. She let it pass. Pete talked about a neighbor's new dog and a book he had started reading. Jenna listened, and for the first time in a long while, she noticed the shape of Pete's voice when it was not competing with screens. The next morning, Jenna woke early and reached for her phone out of habit. She stopped, She lay still and listened to the house. A furnace click. A branch tapping lightly against a window. Pete's breathing beside her. The sounds were ordinary. The moment felt strangely full. Later, Jenna called her son at college. The call was not to manage anything. She asked how he was eating and what he was reading. The conversation wandered. Jenna noticed that when she was not rushing, her son stayed on the line longer. He told her about a professor who made him think. He told her about a friend who was struggling. Jenna listened without trying to solve it. She simply stayed. On Sunday, Jenna and Pete went for a walk without phones. They crossed a small bridge over a creek and stopped to watch water move around stones. Pete pointed out a bird perched on a branch. Jenna watched the bird turn its head, alert and still. She felt her attention gather in a way it had not gathered in years. In later years, Jenna began to see that time well spent was not always the time that looked productive. It was time where attention was allowed to return to the people in front of her, the small shared rituals, the quiet minutes that did not need to be interrupted to feel real. A week later, Jenna met Marla for breakfast. They left their phones in their cars on purpose, like a small experiment. They ate eggs and toast and talked about their teenagers, their aging parents, and the odd relief of being unreachable. When the server refilled coffee, Jenna watched the dark liquid rise and felt the simple comfort of noticing it. She walked out into daylight afterward and felt as if she had been given extra hours, even though the clock had not changed. Some moments feel important because they are loud. Other moments become important later because they were the ones where attention finally stopped running and stayed where life was actually happening. Calvin had not played the piano in years. The instrument sat in the corner of the living room like a piece of furniture that carried a story no one asked about. When he was younger, he played often, not professionally but steadily. He played after dinner and on weekends, letting the keys pull his attention into a narrow calm. Then life got busy. He told himself he would return to it. At 60, Calvin's hands still worked well, but they felt unfamiliar on the keys. His wife, Denise, had mentioned the piano a few times over the years, gently, without pushing. Denise had her own habits, a morning walk, a small herb garden, an hour of reading at night. She had learned not to nag. She had also learned to notice when Calvin's attention was tight and restless. Calvin's older brother, Marcus, called one afternoon and said he was coming through town. The brothers had been close as kids, then drifted as families, and jobs pulled them into separate lanes. They kept contact through holiday calls and brief texts. The call felt like a bridge appearing in a place Calvin had assumed was closed. Marcus arrived on Saturday with a small overnight bag and a paper bag of pastries. He looked older, heavier around the eyes, but still carried the same easy grin. They sat at the kitchen table while Denise made coffee. The conversation started with practical updates, health checkups, work stories, traffic. Then Marcus asked about the piano. Calvin laughed and said the piano was mostly decorative now. Marcus nodded and told Calvin he had started playing guitar again. Just a few chords, nothing impressive. He said he did it because the days were getting quieter and he did not want to fill the quiet with worry. Calvin heard the sentence and felt something loosen. He realized he had been filling his own quiet with news, with distractions, with small arguments in his head that went nowhere. After dinner, Denise cleared the dishes and went to the den with a book. Calvin and Marcus stood in the living room near the piano. The lamplight made the keys look softer. Calvin sat on the bench and lifted the fullboard. The smell of old wood and felt rose up, familiar and faint. He pressed a key. The sound was slightly out of tune. Calvin smiled anyway. Marcus sat in an armchair and listened without joking. Calvin played a simple melody he remembered from childhood, a song their mother used to hum while cooking. His fingers stumbled, then found the pattern. The melody came out uneven, but true enough to be recognized. Marcus closed his eyes and nodded slowly, keeping time with a foot on the carpet. Denise peeked in from the hallway and watched for a moment, then quietly returned to her book, leaving the brothers alone with the sound. Calvin played for 20 minutes, then stopped. The silence after you felt gentle, like a blanket. Marcus said he had forgotten how their mother sounded until the melody brought it back. Calvin felt a small ache and a small gratitude at once. They sat in the quiet and did not rush to fill it. The next morning, Marcus left after breakfast. At the door, he hugged Calvin longer than usual and said they should not wait so long next time. Calvin nodded. He watched Marcus drive away, then returned to the living room and opened the piano again. He played the same melody, slower, letting each note land. Denise came in and sat on the couch. She did not praise him. She simply stayed. Calvin noticed that the best minutes of the weekend were not the updates, not the errands, not the talk about schedules. They were the minutes where attention narrowed into music and memory, shared with another person who recognized the same sound. In later years, time well spent sometimes arrived as a return to an old skill, a return to a brother, a return to a part of the self that had been crowded out by urgency. The notes did not solve anything. They made the day feel whole. That afternoon, Calvin and Denise took a walk around the block. Calvin told her quietly that he had missed playing more than he realized. Denise squeezed his hand once and said she knew. They walked past a yard where children were kicking a ball, shouting and laughing. Calvin watched them and remembered that joy often sounded like noise from the outside and like relief from the inside. Some seasons teach people to chase what is urgent. Other seasons teach them to return to what is steady. Music, a familiar voice, a shared silence. The worth of those minutes is felt later, when the house is quiet and the mind finally knows where it wants to rest. Lydia joined the book club by accident. She was 70 and had stopped at the community center to ask about a chair yoga class. The receptionist handed her a flyer with several options. Lydia glanced at the list, saw book club on Tuesday evenings, and circled it without thinking. She told herself she would try it once, and then decide. Lydia had been widowed for 4 years. Her husband, Alan, had been the social one. He knew neighbors' names, brought extra chairs out for gatherings, and struck up conversations in grocery store lines. Lydia loved him for it. She also relied on him for it. After he died, Lydia found that her own attention had narrowed. It went to bills, to house maintenance, to the careful management of days. The evenings felt long. On the first Tuesday, Lydia arrived early and sat in a folding chair near the door. She held the book in her lap like a shield. The room filled slowly with older adults carrying paperbacks and water bottles. A woman named Sharon sat beside her and asked if Lydia was new. Lydia said yes and smiled. Sharon said she was glad Lydia came, as if Lydia's presence mattered before anyone knew anything about her. The discussion began with polite opinions about characters and plot. Lydia listened more than she spoke. She watched faces as people talked, the small expressions that showed when someone felt heard. She noticed that the group moved slowly, not because they were dull, but because they were unhurried. No one tried to win the conversation. Halfway through, Sharon mentioned her husband's recent surgery. The room responded with quiet concern. No one offered dramatic advice. They simply asked how he was doing and nodded as Sharon spoke. Lydia felt her attention shift. The talk was not about the book anymore. It was about the small realities behind people's days. Lydia felt a subtle relief in that. She had been carrying her own life in silence for years, assuming no one needed to hear it. After the meeting, Sharon invited Lydia to stay for tea in the hallway, where a small table held paper cups. Lydia almost declined out of habit. Then she stayed. They stood with warm cups in their hands and spoke about simple things: weather, grandchildren, the difficulty of sleeping when the house is too quiet. Sharon mentioned that she sometimes left a lamp on just so a room felt occupied. Lydia laughed softly. She had done the same. In the weeks that followed, Lydia began to look forward to Tuesday evenings. The book mattered, but it was not the main reason. The main reason was the slow, steady practice of being with other people in a room, listening and being listened to, without pressure to be entertaining or impressive. One evening, Lydia brought a plate of cookies. She placed it on the table and sat down. The group thanked her. A man across the table said the cookies reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen. Someone else asked for the recipe. Lydia felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest. The cookies were ordinary. The moment of being received was not. At home after book club, Lydia walked into a living room that used to feel empty. It still held quiet, but the quiet felt different. She turned on a lamp, set her bag down, and stood for a moment looking at Alan's photo on the shelf. She did not speak. She simply felt the day settle. In early spring, the group chose a book Lydia did not enjoy. The plot felt thin and the writing irritated her. In the past, Lydia would have used that as a reason to quit. On Tuesday, she went anyway. The conversation that night turned into a discussion about patience, about how some seasons in life are plain and still deserve care. Lydia realized the room was teaching her something not about literature, but about staying. Afterward, Sharon walked Lydia to her car. The parking lot was damp and smelled like rain. Sharon asked if Lydia wanted to join her for a short walk on Saturday mornings. Lydia hesitated, then said yes. On Saturday, they met at a small park and walked slowly on a paved loop, watching ducks gather near a pond. They spoke in short bursts and let silence fill the rest. Lydia found that the shared silence did not feel awkward. It felt companionable. That week, Lydia called her sister and left a voicemail, then called again the next day and reached her. The conversation was ordinary and a little clumsy at first. By the end, Lydia felt the relief of a door reopened before it stuck. In later years, time well spent often came from small, repeated meetings: Tuesday chairs, a paper cup of tea, a Saturday loop around a pond. Attention widened again, and the minutes grew lighter because they were carried with someone else. Marta's garden was not impressive. It was a narrow strip behind a townhouse, bordered by a fence and shaded for half the day. Still, Marta treated it like a small sanctuary. She was 57, still working full-time, still juggling obligations, but she stepped into the garden in the evenings as if stepping into a different pace. Her husband, Glenn, was the one who had suggested planting something years earlier. Glenn liked the idea of a place that asked for steady attention without noise. Marta had rolled her eyes at first. She had been busy. She had been tired. She had been convinced that rest had to be earned. Glenn planted a few herbs anyway. Marta watched them grow in spite of her indifference, and the stubborn quiet of it began to appeal to her. Marta worked in healthcare administration. Her days were full of problems that arrived with urgency. A scheduling mistake, a patient complaint, a staffing shortage. Even when she left the office, her mind stayed on. She would reach home and start another set of tasks: laundry, dinner, answering texts, preparing for the next day. The hours were used up quickly, and Marta often felt as if she had lived them at a distance. One evening, Glenn came home looking worn out. He did not complain. He simply sat at the kitchen table and stared at his hands. Marta asked what was wrong. Glenn said his older brother had called with bad news about a diagnosis. Glenn said it quietly, as if speaking louder would make it more real. Marta turned off the stove, set a lid on the pot, and sat across from him. She did not rush to reassure. She did not reach for practical steps. She simply listened as Glenn described the call, the tone of his brother's voice, the long pause before details came out. Marta noticed that her attention, which so often scattered, could become fully steady when it mattered. She held the minute and stayed with him. After dinner, Glenn went outside. Marta followed. The air was cool and smelled like damp soil. Glenn knelt beside a small plant and pinched off a dead leaf. The motion was slow, careful. Marta crouched beside him. They worked in silence, pulling weeds and smoothing the soil. The garden did not change much. The work did not fix the diagnosis. Still, the minutes felt useful in a different way. They gave the mind something gentle to hold. Later, Glenn's brother called again. Marta sat on the porch steps while Glenn talked, giving him space but staying close enough to be felt. Glenn's voice was steady. When he ended the call, he leaned his shoulder lightly against Marta's. Marta noticed how much comfort could be carried in such a small contact. In the days that followed, Marta made room for a few new rituals. She left her phone inside during the first 10 minutes in the garden. She took her coffee outside on Saturday mornings and watched the light shift across leaves. When Glenn's brother came to town for an appointment, they made dinner together and ate slowly, talking about ordinary memories as if they were ropes tied to something solid. Marta realized that time well spent was not only the time that solved problems. Some of the best minutes were the ones where attention stayed present with another person, where the hands did a small, steady task, where the day slowed enough to feel lived rather than survived. In later years, the garden remained small. It never became impressive. What it offered was steadiness, a place for attention to land, a place for worry to soften, and a reminder that some minutes matter because they hold two people in the same quiet moment. A month later, Marta drove Glenn to meet his brother at a clinic. The waiting room was bright and too cold. People stared at phones and magazines, trying not to look afraid. Marta watched Glenn's brother pick at a paper cup lid with his thumb. Glenn reached across and rested a hand on his brother's forearm. No words were needed. Marta noticed how quickly the room became bearable when a hand found another hand. On the ride home, Glenn's brother stared out the window and talked about a childhood bike they shared, how they used to ride until streetlights came on. The memory made him smile briefly. Marta listened and realized that even in hard seasons, people return to the small scenes that once felt safe. That night, Marta watered the garden and let the hose run a little longer than necessary, enjoying the sound of water hitting soil. Glenn stood beside her and breathed more easily. In later years, the minutes that mattered were often not the heroic ones. They were the ones where attention stayed steady during uncertainty, where ordinary rituals carried people through, and where a small garden offered a place to stand together. Eddie stopped driving at 88. It was not a dramatic decision. It was a quiet one, made after he misjudged a turn and felt his heart jump. He told his son, Joel, that he was done. Joel nodded and said he would handle rides. Eddie expected to feel trapped. Instead, he felt a strange relief, as if one more layer of vigilance had been peeled away. Joel was 61 and worked nearby. He came by twice a week after work, usually with a bag of groceries and a list of small things to check. Eddie's house was old, full of soft creaks and familiar smells. Eddie still lived alone, but he was not isolated. Neighbors waved. A niece called on Sundays. Joel kept his father's world stitched together in practical ways. At first, Joel treated the visits like a checklist. Smoke detector batteries, prescription refills, trash day. Eddie appreciated the help, but he noticed that Joel stayed slightly tense, eyes scanning for problems. Joel talked quickly. He stayed standing while Eddie sat. The minutes moved like errands. One evening, as Joel tightened a loose doorknob, Eddie said he missed driving to the diner on Saturday mornings. He did not say it as a complaint. He said it as a fact. Joel paused, then said he could drive Eddie there this weekend. Eddie nodded, surprised by the quick agreement. On Saturday, Joel picked Eddie up early. The car smelled like coffee. Joel drove carefully, not because Eddie demanded it, but because Joel was suddenly aware of what the ride meant. They arrived at the diner and sat in a booth near the window. A waitress recognized Eddie and greeted him warmly. Eddie smiled and said it had been a while. The waitress said she was glad to see him back, and the simple sentence landed with weight. They ordered breakfast. Eddie watched Joel read the menu, the way his son's hair had thinned, the way his hands looked tired. Eddie realized he had spent years worrying about his children, as if worry were a form of love. He also realized that the best gift he could offer now was not more worry. It was attention, steady and calm. They ate slowly. Joel asked Eddie about old jobs, old neighbors, old family stories. Eddie answered in the plain way he always had, not polishing the past, not turning it into a lesson. He spoke about a coworker who always whistled, about a winter when pipes froze, about a summer afternoon when he and Eddie's mother sat on the porch and said nothing for an hour. Joel listened as if the details mattered. Eddie felt his throat tighten. After breakfast, they sat in the car for a minute before leaving. Eddie did not rush Joel. Joel did not rush Eddie. The morning had space. On the drive back, Joel took a longer route through quiet streets lined with bare trees. Eddie watched sunlight fall across lawns. He felt the steady comfort of being moved through the world without having to steer. Back at Eddie's house, Joel carried groceries in and set them on the counter. Then, instead of leaving, he sat at the kitchen table. Eddie sat across from him. They drank coffee and talked about nothing urgent. Eddie noticed that Joel's shoulders dropped. The checklist had been completed, but the morning did not end. It became something else. In later years, time well spent was often time spent inside ordinary routines that became shared again. A diner booth, familiar greeting, a longer drive home. These minutes did not add new achievements. They returned something older, the feeling of being together in a day that did not need to be rushed. The next week, Joel brought his daughter, Nina, along. Nina was in her 30s and kissed Eddie's cheek, saying she should visit more. Eddie waved it off. He wanted her here now, not apologizing. They sat at the table while Joel fixed a drawer that stuck. Nina told Eddie about her work, and Eddie listened with a slow focus that made her talk longer. When she paused, Eddie asked one small question that showed he had heard her. Nina smiled, surprised. Before they left, Nina asked if Eddie remembered the paper airplanes he used to fold for her. Eddie laughed and folded one carefully, creasing the paper with a thumbnail. The airplane flew across the room and landed near the couch. Nina clapped softly. Joel watched with a quiet tenderness. After they left, Eddie stood at the window and watched their car pull away. The street was calm. Eddie did not feel trapped. He felt anchored. In later years, some of the most valuable minutes arrived when people stopped treating time as a checklist and started treating it as something to share. A ride, a meal, a paper airplane crossing a room. Attention made those small scenes last. Tanya thought she would remember the soccer games forever. In her 30s and 40s, she sat on folding chairs in damp grass and watched her son run up and down a field. She clapped, shouted encouragement, and drove home with snacks and muddy cleats in the trunk. At the time, the games felt like part of a busy stretch she would outgrow. She did not realize how quickly the stretch would end. At 52, Tanya's son was grown and working. He called weekly, sometimes more, but the calls were short. Tanya was glad for them and also aware of what had changed. The steady hours of being needed had faded, replaced by a quieter relationship that required a different kind of attention. Tanya worked from home and lived with her partner, Greg, in a small house with a narrow porch. Greg was the calmer one. He cooked dinner without fuss, kept a few plants alive, and suggested walks when Tanya's mind started racing. Tanya loved him for his steadiness and sometimes resented it, because steadiness made her notice her own restlessness. One evening, Tanya's son texted that he might stop by on Saturday to pick up a box of old things. Tanya felt a sudden surge of purpose. She spent Friday night cleaning the basement and sorting items into piles: keep, donate, trash. She worked quickly, as if speed could somehow make the visit last longer. Greg came downstairs and suggested she take a break. Tanya said she was fine. On Saturday morning, Tanya made coffee and waited. She checked the driveway more than once. When her son arrived, he carried an empty plastic bin and smiled, a little tired. Tanya hugged him and felt how strong he had become. They went to the basement and looked through boxes. The objects were ordinary: a childhood trophy, a stack of school papers, a sweatshirt with faded letters. Tanya began telling stories attached to each item, trying to make the moment feel full. Her son listened politely, then sat on the basement steps and looked at Tanya. He said gently that he did not need all the stories. He said he just wanted to be there for a while. Tanya felt her face warm. She realized she was performing the visit instead of living it. They carried a few boxes upstairs and set them by the door. Then they sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Greg joined them and asked how work was going. Tanya's son talked about a new project, a co-worker who made him laugh, an idea he was considering. Tanya listened without interrupting, without steering. She noticed that when she stopped trying to fill the space, her son filled it on his own. After a while, Tanya's son asked if she still had the old photo albums. Tanya brought one out and set it on the table. They turned pages slowly. There were photos from the soccer years, from birthdays, from vacations where nothing special happened except being together. Tanya watched her son look at his younger face and the smile. Greg pointed out a picture where Tanya's hair was windblown, and she looked carefree. Tanya laughed softly, surprised by herself. When her son left, Tanya did not rush to clean up. She left the album on the table for a while. Greg washed dishes and hummed. Tanya stood at the window and watched the street, letting the quiet settle. The visit had not been long. It had been good because her attention had finally stayed with it. In later years, the moments that mattered were often the ones that did not need to be decorated. A grown child sitting on a step, a coffee at a table, a photo turned slowly. Time well spent was not always about doing more. It was about being fully present for what arrived. That night, Tanya texted her son a simple thank you for coming. He replied with a heart emoji and a short line saying he liked looking at the photos. Tanya felt the warmth of it linger. The next weekend, Greg suggested they walk past the local park. A youth game was happening on the field. Tanya almost kept walking. Then she stopped by the fence and watched for a few minutes. The scene was familiar, the shouts, the whistles, the parents calling names. Tanya noticed that the game was not hers anymore, but the feeling of attention settling into a simple shared moment still was. Greg stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. They watched in silence, then continued their walk without talking much. On Monday, Tanya called her son during lunch and asked what he was cooking lately. The question was small. The conversation stayed small. It lasted longer than their usual calls. When they hung up, Tanya noticed that the day felt steadier. Not because anything was solved, but because a connection had been tended. In later years, people often found that the worth of time could not be forced. It showed itself when attention stopped rushing and simply stayed. A visit, a walk by a field, a phone call about dinner. The moments did not look grand, but they held what mattered. Marisol kept a small stack of bus passes in a ceramic dish by the door. She could afford to drive, and she still owned a car, but she had started taking the bus a few mornings a week because it slowed her down in a way she could not fake. At 59, Marisol worked part-time at a bookstore in a small shopping strip near the river. The job was quiet. She liked straightening shelves and watching people choose a book, the way they chose a piece of fruit, weighing it in the hand. Her daughter was grown and lived in another state. They talked on weekends, sometimes longer, and their calls were warm and practical. Marisol had not always moved slowly. In her 40s, after a divorce, she worked 2 jobs and drove everywhere with her mind already at the next stop. She kept a tight grip on time, afraid that any delay would unravel the day. The bills were steady now, but the habit of rushing still lived in her shoulders. Taking the bus was her gentle way of loosening it. On Tuesdays, Marisol took the early route to the shop. She sat near the front, close enough to hear the driver greet regulars. The driver knew faces. "Good morning," he would say, and people would answer, as if that was the first small success of the day. One morning, a man climbed on slowly, steadying himself with a hand on the rail. He carried a paper bag with a pharmacy logo and a folded receipt sticking out of the top. Marisol recognized him from the route, always quiet, always sitting alone. This time he chose the seat across from her and nodded once. Marisol nodded back. At the next stop, a woman with a toddler climbed on, juggling a stroller and a tote bag. The toddler fussed and kicked at the blanket. The driver waited and asked if she wanted help with the ramp. The woman muttered thanks and worked the stroller into the aisle, cheeks pink with strain. Marisol felt the old urge to speed the moment along, to make it less awkward. She stayed still instead, letting the scene unfold at its own pace as the bus pulled away from the curb. The quiet man across from her reached into his pocket and produced a small toy car, scuffed along the roof. He rolled it gently across the seat toward the toddler, not making a show of it. The toddler stopped crying and stared. The mother looked surprised, then smiled with relief. The toy car rolled back toward the man as the bus swayed. He caught it and held it still, letting the toddler watch. The toddler leaned forward, eyes wide. The mother whispered something like, "Thank you." The man shrugged as if it were nothing and looked out the window again. The toddler stayed quiet, following the toy with steady attention. Marisol watched and felt something soften. The gesture was small and almost invisible. It did not fix the day. It made the day more bearable for a stranger, and it made the bus feel briefly like a shared room instead of a moving box of separate lives. A few stops later, the man stood to get off. As he passed Marisol, he paused and said quietly, "Have a good one." Marisol answered, "You too." The words were plain, but they carried warmth because they were unforced. At the bookstore, Marisol arranged a display of new arrivals and watched customers drift in. A co-worker asked if traffic had been bad. Marisol said she took the bus. The co-worker smiled as if imagining it. Marisol did not explain. She did not need to. On her lunch break, Marisol called her sister and listened to a short update about a checkup. Nothing alarming, just the usual. After the call, Marisol sent her daughter a quick text about a book she thought she would like. Her daughter replied with a heart and a question about dinner plans. The exchange took less than a minute. It left a warmth that lasted longer. Marisol noticed that her attention stayed calmer than it did on mornings when she drove. The bus ride had given her a slower beginning. It had also given her a small story to hold. The toy car, the toddler's sudden quiet, the way the mother's shoulders dropped. As seasons change, some moments stand out, not because they are impressive, but because they show what care looks like when no one is keeping score. A bus ride, a toy car, a simple goodbye. These are minutes that do not demand attention. They earn it. That evening, Marisol set her keys in the dish beside the passes and left them there. She made tea and stood by the window, watching the last light thin out over the street. The day felt quietly complete, not because she had done more, but because she had noticed more. Howard and Elsie went to the laundromat on Wednesday mornings because the machines at home were old and loud. They could have replaced them, but the laundromat had become a small routine that held them together in a gentle way. Howard was 74 and moved with careful knees. Elsie was 71 and still drove, still kept lists on paper, still folded shirts with a crisp edge that made them look new. They had been married for 49 years. They rarely argued. Their disagreements, when they happened, were about small things that did not last. A cabinet door left open, a light left on. At the laundromat, they used the same two washers at the end of the row. Howard carried the detergent. Elsie carried a bag of quarters, even though the place accepted cards now. She said quarters made the process feel real. They loaded clothes and sat on a plastic bench near the window. Outside, traffic moved past in a steady stream. Inside, the machines turned and thumped with a rhythm that was almost soothing. Elsie opened a paperback and read. Howard watched the spin cycle and listened to the small hum of motors. A young woman came in with 2 laundry baskets and a child on her hip. The child looked sleepy and limp. The woman's hair was pulled back quickly, and her coat was too thin for the cold. She struggled to open the door while balancing the baskets. Howard stood and held the door without making a point of it. The woman thanked him with a tired nod. She chose a washer near theirs and began sorting clothes with quick hands. A small sock fell to the floor. The child whimpered. The woman sighed and pressed her forehead briefly against the machine, as if gathering herself. Elsie watched, then reached into her own basket and pulled out a clean pair of mittens. She kept extra mittens in winter for reasons she could not fully explain. She offered them to the child, saying, "These are soft." The child took them and rubbed them against a cheek. Comforted by the texture, the woman's shoulders dropped a little. They did not become close friends in an instant. They spoke in small sentences, the safe kind. Elsie asked how old the child was. The woman said 2, almost 3. Howard asked if she lived nearby. The woman said yes, just a few blocks, and that she usually walked. She laughed once, quietly, and said she was always behind on laundry. Howard nodded as if he understood. He did understand. In his working years, he had been behind on everything that mattered. Behind on dinners, behind on phone calls, behind on noticing that his children were growing fast. He had been present, but not fully. He remembered the way Elsie used to tap a spoon against a pot while waiting for him to come home, the small sound that meant she was still awake. Now, in the laundromat, waiting was not a failure. It was the point. The machines would take the time they took. The clothes would dry when they dried. The world would keep moving outside the window, whether they rushed or not. The young woman's washer finished and beeped. She moved clothes into a dryer and searched for coins. She patted her pockets, then looked into her bag. Her face tightened. Elsie slid the quarter bag across the bench and said, "Just take what you need." The woman hesitated, then took a few coins and said she would pay it back. Elsie waved it off with a small smile that made the offer feel ordinary. When the dryers ran, the child fell asleep on the woman's shoulder. The woman sat still, holding the weight with both arms. Howard watched and thought about how long it had been since he held one of his own children while they slept. The memory arrived without pain. It arrived as a soft reminder. Elsie turned a page in her book and kept reading, the way people do when they trust quiet. Howard leaned back and let the warm air from the machines brush his face. For a few minutes, the room felt like a small shelter where no one had to prove anything. When the clothes were done, Howard and Elsie folded theirs at a table. The woman folded hers one-handed while the child slept. Elsie helped without asking, folding small shirts and stacking them neatly. The woman whispered thank you again, and this time her eyes looked less strained. Some time becomes valuable because it is packed with events. Other time becomes valuable because it holds a small exchange, help offered without fuss, waiting shared in the same room, a stranger's shoulders relaxing by a few degrees. Howard and Elsie carried their warm laundry out to the car and drove home in silence, the kind that felt companionable. That afternoon, Elsie stacked the folded towels in the closet and said quietly, "I like that place." Howard nodded and said, "Me too." The day had been plain. It had been well spent. Darryl kept a small tool bag by the back door, even though he was retired. The bag was not heavy, just a flashlight, a voltage tester, a screwdriver set, a roll of electrical tape. He told his wife, Kim, it was habit. Kim said it was also identity, and Darryl did not argue. Darryl was 68 and had been an electrician for 45 years. He liked clean work and clear outcomes. A problem, a solution. a result. After retirement, he expected to enjoy the freedom. Instead, he found himself restless, waking early as if a job site were waiting. Kim handled retirement differently. She cooked slowly, took walks, and spent time on the phone with her sister. She did not rush to fill every hour. When Daryl paced the kitchen, Kim would say, "You can sit down, you know." Daryl would smile and pretend he had something to check. One afternoon, their neighbor, Evan, knocked on the door. Evan was in his early 30s and had just moved in with his partner, Jules. Evan said the lights in their hallway kept flickering, and he was worried about a fire hazard. Daryl nodded and grabbed the tool bag. Kim watched him go and called out, "Take your time." Daryl waved as if that was exactly what he intended. At Evan's house, Daryl examined the breaker panel, tested the switch, and opened the outlet cover. The issue was simple, a loose connection that had been warming and cooling with use. Daryl tightened the screw, reseated the wire, and replaced the cover. The hallway lights steadied. Evan looked relieved in a way that made Daryl feel useful. Evan offered money. Daryl refused. Evan offered a beer. Daryl almost refused out of habit, then paused. Jules appeared from the kitchen with 3 glasses and said she had iced tea if he preferred. Daryl said iced tea sounded good. They sat at the kitchen table. The air smelled like fresh paint. A moving box sat half open near the wall. Evan apologized for the mess. Daryl said it was fine. He took a sip and felt the cold sweetness settle. Evan asked how long Daryl had done electrical work. Daryl answered with a number, then found himself telling a story, not the proud story he usually told, but a small one. He described an older foreman who taught him to always test twice and to treat every wire as if it were live until proven otherwise. He described the foreman's calm hands, the way he never hurried a young apprentice. Jules listened with a soft focus. Evan asked questions. Daryl noticed that he was enjoying the talking more than the fixing. He had assumed his value came from what he could repair. He had not realized how much of his work life had also been a quiet web of people helping each other learn. Kim texted once to ask if everything was okay. Daryl typed back, "All good." He did not mention that he was sitting in a neighbor's kitchen telling stories. It felt like something new and slightly fragile. After a while, Jules said they were trying to learn basic home repairs, but felt intimidated. Daryl laughed and said the basics mattered most. He offered to show them how to shut off power at the main, how to test an outlet, how to recognize a problem that needed a professional. He spoke in simple language, not to impress, but to make it usable. Evan walked Daryl to the door and said, "Thanks for coming over." Daryl nodded. Evan added, "It's nice having people nearby." Daryl felt the sentence land in a place he had not expected. Back home, Kim was reading on the couch. Daryl set the tool bag down and sat beside her. Kim looked over the top of her book and said, "So?" Daryl smiled and said it was a loose wire. Kim said, "I figured." Then she asked, "Did you rush out and rush back?" Daryl shook his head and admitted he stayed a while. He told her about the iced tea and the moving boxes. Kim reached for his hand and squeezed it once. Daryl covered her hand with his and sat still, letting the quiet be enough. With time, Daryl began to notice that the best minutes were not always the ones where he proved he was competent. They were the minutes where he stayed in a room with other people, shared what he knew, and let the hour be ordinary. A tightened screw mattered, So did a glass of iced tea at a neighbor's table. That evening, Darryl sat on the back steps with Kim and watched the sky fade. A porch light clicked on across the yard. He did not feel the need to find another task. The day had been useful, and it had also been shared. That combination felt like time well spent for once. Nora visited her mother every Saturday at 2 o'clock because that was the hour her mother was usually awake and calm. The facility called it memory care. Nora called it a place where time moved differently, slower, and less certain. Nora was 63 and still worked 3 days a week as a dental hygienist. She kept a neat schedule and a neat house. Her friends said she was organized. Nora knew it was not organization. It was how she kept fear in a manageable shape. Her mother, June, had been a sharp woman once, quick with names and recipes and opinions. June had run a small catering business and could remember who liked extra pepper without writing it down. Now June sometimes looked at Nora as if Nora were a kind stranger. Other times she would say Nora's name with sudden clarity and then lose it again. Nora arrived with a small tote bag containing lotion, a hairbrush, and a box of soft cookies. The front desk worker greeted her and said June had been a little restless after lunch. Nora nodded and walked down the hallway, passing framed photos of gardens and beaches meant to look calming. In June's room, June sat by the window in a chair with a blanket across her knees. Her hair was thin and slightly tangled. The television was on with the volume low. June turned her head when Nora entered and watched her with a guarded expression. "Hi, Mum," Nora said, keeping her voice even. June blinked and said, "Hello." Then, after a pause, she said, "You're early." Nora smiled and said, "It's 2 o'clock." June frowned as if the number did not mean much. Nora set the tote bag down and took out the lotion. She rubbed it into June's hands slowly, the way she used to do when June's skin got dry in winter. June watched Nora's hands as if watching a craft. After a minute, June relaxed her fingers and let Nora hold them. Nora brushed June's hair in small strokes. The brush caught once, and Nora eased it free, without tugging. June made a small sound, not pain, just recognition. Nora's mind tried to jump ahead to practical concerns, medication schedules, paperwork, the next appointment. She felt the impulse to ask staff questions right away, to do something that could be checked off. Instead, she stayed with the brushing. She watched the window light move across June's cheek. She listened to a distant cart rolling in the hallway. June's breathing slowed. For a few minutes, there was no urgency. There was only presence. Nora offered a cookie. June took it and nibbled, crumbs falling onto the blanket. Nora picked up the crumbs and brushed them away. June looked at Nora's face for a long time, studying. Then June said, "Your hair looks nice." Nora felt her eyes sting. She said, "Thank you." June began to hum under her breath. A tune Nora recognized from childhood, the kind her mother used to hum while cooking. The notes were uneven, but the rhythm was there. Nora did not interrupt. She let the humming fill the space the way it used to fill a kitchen. A nurse knocked and came in to ask if June had eaten. Nora answered, and the nurse adjusted the blanket with a practiced hand. June watched the nurse with suspicion, then looked back at Nora, as if Nora were the one she trusted to interpret the room. Nora sat beside June and told her a simple story about the bookstore where she sometimes stopped after work. The smell of paper, the way people spoke softly in the aisles. June listened, or seemed to. June's eyes drifted toward the window. Nora did not push for responses. She let the story be a sound. something gentle in the room. Near the end of the visit, Nora stood to leave and felt June's fingers tighten around hers. The grip was brief, but real. June looked up and said, "Come back." Nora said, "I will." June nodded once, as if that was enough to hold on to. In the car afterward, Nora sat for a minute before starting the engine. She used to measure her visits by whether her mother recognized her, whether she got answers to questions, whether she could get something done. Now she measured them differently. A relaxed hand, a quiet room, a single sentence that landed. Over time, the minutes that mattered were often the ones that did not produce clarity or progress. They were small acts of care repeated, a brush through thin hair, lotion warmed by palms, a grip that said trust. In a life where so much could not be controlled, those minutes were still worth giving full attention. Nora drove home and called her husband to say she was on her way. He asked how it went. Nora paused and said, "It was good." Then she added, "We just sat for a while." Her husband understood, and the line stayed quiet in a way that felt supportive. Pete put the for sale sign in the window of his old pickup and then sat in the driver's seat for a long time without turning the key. The sign was meant for the boat, not the truck, but the truck felt included in the decision. Pete was 72 and had kept a small fishing boat behind the garage for nearly 20 years. He did not take it out as often now. The straps were stiff. The trailer lights were finicky. His back complained more than it used to. Still, the boat was a symbol of a kind of time he valued, time that did not need to be explained. His wife, Alana, had been patient about the boat. She liked the lake too, but she liked it more as a place to sit with a sandwich and watch water move. She had told Pete, gently, that he did not have to keep the boat forever. Pete knew that. He also knew that letting go of objects sometimes felt like letting go of versions of the self. Their grandson, Milo, was 12 and lived close by. Milo came over after school a few days a week while Pete and Alana's daughter worked. Milo was in a stage where he could be talkative one minute and silent the next. Pete liked him anyway. He liked the way Milo's attention could lock on to a small detail, a knot in a rope, a bug on a leaf, a line on a map. On the Saturday, Pete hung the sign. Milo arrived with a backpack and said he had finished his homework early. He told Pete about a science project, how his group kept arguing about who would present. Pete listened and asked a couple of questions. Milo looked relieved, as if being heard was its own kind of rest. Pete glanced at the sign in the window and felt a small wave of regret. Then Milo asked if they could go to the lake. Pete hesitated. The boat was still in good shape. He could tow it. He could manage one more outing. Alana heard the question from the kitchen and called out, "Go, I'll pack snacks." They drove to the launch ramp under a pale sky. Pete moved slowly, careful with the hitch, careful with the straps. Milo stood nearby and watched without complaining. When Pete struggled with a latch, Milo offered a hand. Pete accepted it, not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of partnership. On the water, the motor started on the second try. Pete laughed softly, relieved. They cruised at a gentle pace along the shoreline. Milo pointed at a heron standing in the shallows. Pete cut the engine and let the boat drift so they could watch. The heron lifted one leg, still as a statue, then speared at the water with sudden speed. Milo whispered, "Wow," as if he had witnessed something rare. They fished for an hour without catching much. Milo did not care. He asked Pete about the first time he ever drove a boat. Pete told him about being a teenager on a friend's father's boat. Nervous, gripping the wheel too hard. Milo asked if Pete was ever scared then. Pete said yes, and that he still got a little scared sometimes, just in quieter ways. Alana sat in the front of the boat with her feet tucked under her, eating an apple. She watched the two of them talk and smiled. Pete noticed her smile and felt a tenderness that surprised him. The day was not about fish. It was about being together in the same moving quiet. On the way back, Milo leaned against the seat and stared at the sky. Pete steered slowly, listening to the water slap against the hull. He realized that this was what he had been afraid of losing, not the boat itself, but the kind of minutes the boat made possible. At the ramp, Milo helped again, holding a rope, handing Pete a towel, asking what each part was called. Pete answered patiently. Alana carried the snack bag back to the truck and said, "That was a good day." Pete nodded. That evening, Pete did not remove the for sale sign. He did not feel guilty about it either. He understood something simple. Objects come and go. The time inside them is what lasts. A heron in the shallows, a boy whispering, "Wow," a wife smiling from the front of a boat. Later, when a buyer called, Pete agreed to meet. He told Milo the boat would be going to someone else. Milo looked disappointed for a second, then asked if they could still go to the lake sometimes. Pete said yes. Milo nodded, satisfied. The sign stayed in the window until the boat was gone, and Pete still drove the truck to the lake now and then, just to sit with Alana on a bench and watch water move. He found that time well spent was not tied to keeping everything. It was tied to noticing what mattered while it was here. Even without the boat, the lake was still there. Renee said they should clean the attic because the air conditioner repairman needed access to the ductwork, and because it was time anyway. She said it with the tone she used when she wanted Mark to agree, without debate. Mark was 65 and had learned that some projects were really about something else. The attic was about ducks, but it was also about letting go. Renee did not like clutter. Mark liked keeping things because each thing held a story, and stories were easier than change. They carried boxes down one at a time. The attic smelled like dry wood and insulation. Dust rose in soft clouds when Mark shifted a stack of old magazines. Renee wore a bandana over her hair and laughed at herself in the mirror by the hallway, calling it her cleaning costume. Mark smiled and took a picture to send to their daughter. Their daughter replied with a string of laughing faces and asked if they were finally throwing out the college papers. Renee typed, "Probably." Mark typed, "We'll see." In the third box, under a pile of faded sweaters, Mark found a bundle of letters tied with a shoelace. The envelopes were thin and yellowed. The handwriting on the front was careful, slanted slightly to the right. Mark knew the name before he fully saw it. It was Thomas, an old friend from his early 20s, a friend he had not spoken to in decades. Renee looked over his shoulder and said, "Who is that?" Mark sat on the attic floor and loosened the shoelace slowly. He felt a small resistance, as if time itself were tied in that knot. The letters were from a summer when Mark and Thomas worked construction out west, saving money, sleeping on cheap mattresses, sending notes to people back home. Mark had forgotten the details. He had not forgotten the feeling of that year, the sense that life was wide open and full of days that stretched without edges. Mark read one letter aloud. Thomas wrote about a job site prank, about a diner where the waitress called everyone honey, about missing home but loving the road. Renee listened and smiled. She said the voice on the page sounded like a real person, not a memory. Mark found a photograph tucked inside. Two young men squinting in the sun, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, both wearing work boots and cheap sunglasses. Mark's throat tightened. He had not thought about that version of himself in a long time. Renee sat beside him in the narrow attic space. She touched the photograph and said, "You were a kid." Mark nodded. Renee asked what happened to Thomas. Mark said they drifted. Life happened. Jobs and moves and marriage and children. The kind of drift that seems harmless until you notice how far apart you are. They went quiet for a while. Below them, the house made its small sounds. A refrigerator cycling on. A dog shifting on a rug. Mark held the letters and felt the odd mixture of grief and gratitude that comes with remembering. Renee broke the silence by saying, "You could call him." Mark laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it sounded impossible. He said he would not even know how to find him. Renee said, "People get found." Mark looked at her and saw that she meant it. They carried the letters downstairs and set them on the kitchen table like something fragile. Renee made coffee. Mark looked up Thomas's name online and found a phone number attached to a small business 2 states away. He stared at the screen for a long time, finger hovering. Renee sat across from him and said, "Just try. If it's wrong, it's wrong." Mark took a breath and dialed. A man answered. Mark asked, "Is this Thomas?" There was a pause, then a cautious yes. Mark said his name. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the voice on the line warmed, and Thomas said, "Mark. Well, I'll be." They talked for 20 minutes, then 40. They laughed about the diner, the job site, the cheap sunglasses. Thomas said he still had a box of old things too. Mark felt his chest loosen. Renee listened without intruding, washing dishes slowly, so the sound of water gave the call a privacy of its own. After they hung up, Mark sat quietly, almost stunned. Renee said, "That was worth the dust, wasn't it?" Mark nodded. The attic had not been about ducks. It had been about a shoelace knot and the decision to spend an hour reaching back into a life that still mattered. In the years ahead, Mark knew he would forget most of what he threw away that day. He would not forget the moment a name on a screen became a living voice again. Some time is valuable because it creates order. Some time is valuable because it restores a connection you did not realize you still wanted. Mark looked at Renee and said, "Thank you." Renee smiled and said, "You're welcome." Then she picked up another box and kept going. The snow began at dawn and kept falling in a patient way, soft flakes that did not look heavy until the driveway disappeared. By 9, the street was quiet. Tires had not carved tracks yet. Everything looked muted, as if the neighborhood had been wrapped in cloth. Calvin stood at his front window with a mug of coffee and watched the snow settle on the steps. He was 56 and worked from home most days now, a change that still felt strange. In his previous life, he would have been rushing to a train, watching minutes, checking email before his coat was even on. Now he had an extra kind of time, and he was still learning how to use it. His wife, Denise, was upstairs on a video call with her sister. Calvin could hear soft laughter through the floor. The sound made the house feel occupied in a good way, like a place with a pulse. Calvin pulled on the boots and a thick jacket and stepped outside with a shovel. The cold air stung his nose. He cleared his own walkway first, then looked next door. Mrs. Wilcox's porch light was still on. Her front steps were already half buried. Mrs. Wilcox was 83 and lived alone. She had a son who visited when he could, but not often in winter. Calvin hesitated for a second. He told himself she might have someone coming. Then he remembered how rarely anyone came at all. He walked over and started shoveling her steps. The work was steady and quiet. Snow squeaked under the shovel blade. Calvin's shoulders warmed with effort. He cleared a path to the door, then widened it, then moved to the driveway, pushing snow into small piles that grew into larger ones. After a while, Mrs. Wilcox's door opened. She stood in the doorway wearing a thick sweater and a knit hat pulled down over her ears. She watched Calvin for a moment, then said, "You didn't have to do that." Calvin leaned on the shovel and said, "I was out anyway." Mrs. Wilcox frowned as if she did not like owing anyone. Then she said, "Come in for a minute." Calvin started to refuse, then saw her expression and understood that refusing would take something away. He said, "Okay, just for a minute." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon. Mrs. Wilcox led him to the kitchen and poured coffee into a chipped mug. Calvin noticed a small stack of mail on the table and a bowl of oranges. The radio played softly in the background, an old station with no talking, only music. Mrs. Wilcox asked how Denise was. Calvin answered and mentioned the video call upstairs. Mrs. Wilcox nodded and said it was good to have someone to talk to. Calvin said yes. The word felt too small for what it meant. Mrs. Wilcox looked at Calvin's damp sleeves and said, "You'll catch cold." Calvin laughed and said the shovel kept him warm. Mrs. Wilcox went to the stove and stirred a pot. She said she had made soup yesterday, lentil, and it was better today than it was yesterday. She asked if Calvin and Denise would take some. Calvin said they had plenty of food. Mrs. Wilcox waved her hand. She said, "That isn't the point." She ladled soup into a container and pressed it into Calvin's hands with more insistence than strength. When Calvin stepped back outside, he felt the weight of the soup and the warmth of the kitchen still on his face. He finished the driveway quickly and carried the shovel back home. Denise met him at the door and asked where he had gone. Calvin told her, and Denise smiled. She took the container and said, "That's Mrs. Wilcox's way of saying thank you." Calvin nodded. He realized that his shoveling had not only cleared snow, it had opened a door. Later, after lunch, Calvin looked out the window again. The street was still quiet, the snow still falling lightly. He thought about how easily he used to spend his attention on things that evaporated, a thread of notifications, a hurry that never arrived anywhere. A morning with a shovel did not feel dramatic. It felt honest. It had effort and breath and a neighbor's kitchen and a pot of soup that was better the second day. In a season where many people stayed sealed inside, Calvin had touched the small fabric that held a neighborhood together. When Denise warmed the soup for dinner, she set the table with an extra care that made the meal feel like an occasion. Calvin ate slowly and thought about Mrs. Wilcox in her quiet house. He decided he would check on her again tomorrow, not as a project, but as a continuation. Some time becomes worth remembering because it is tied to a result. Other time becomes worth remembering because it is tied to a person. A driveway cleared. A door opened. A bowl of soup shared. Calvin listened to the wind in the trees and felt for once that the day had been spent in the right place. Aisha used to eat lunch standing up, half a sandwich over a sink, one eye on the clock. It was not because she loved speed. It was because she worked in a hospital where the day did not slow down just because a person needed a break. Aisha was 51 and had been a nurse for nearly 3 decades. She was good at the work. She could read a room quickly. She could sense when a patient was frightened, even if the patient was smiling. In her younger years, she measured her value by how much she could carry, how many tasks she could do without asking for help. Recently, after a health scare that turned out to be minor but still sobering, Aisha asked to move to a part-time schedule. Her manager approved it. Her co-workers said she was lucky. Aisha did not correct them. Luck was not the right word. It was a choice she had delayed too long. On her first week of the new schedule, Aisha found herself with a real lunch break. The hospital had a small courtyard with benches and a few winter hardy plants. The air outside was cold, but the sunlight was bright. Aisha sat on a bench with a thermos of soup and a small container of fruit. She felt awkward, as if she was supposed to be doing something else. The silence in her own head felt unfamiliar. In her pocket, her phone vibrated once with a message. Aisha glanced at it, then turned the screen face down. She took a slow breath and let the exhale finish all the way. A co-worker named Maren came through the door and stepped into the courtyard with a paper cup of coffee. Maren was in her late 50s and had a calm energy that Aisha admired. Maren saw Aisha and raised a hand. She asked if she could sit. Aisha said yes. They did not talk at first. They watched a sparrow hop near a planter, pecking at something invisible. The courtyard had the soft sound of distant ventilation fans and muffled voices from inside. After a minute, Maren said, "I used to think breaks were selfish." Aisha laughed quietly and said, "Me too." Maren sipped her coffee and said, "Then one day, I realized the work would take everything if I let it." Aisha felt the sentence and did not argue with it. She had lived that truth without naming it. She had missed school plays. She had postponed vacations. She had promised herself she would slow down later, as if later were guaranteed. Maren asked about Aisha's kids. Aisha said they were grown. One in college and one working. She said she had been proud of how independent they were, and then admitted, softly, that she wished she had been home more when they were small. Maren nodded, not with pity, but with recognition. Aisha told Maren about the health scare. Maren listened and did not rush to reassure. She simply said, "That will get your attention." Aisha said yes. She watched the sparrow again and felt her shoulders lower. When lunch ended, they stood and walked back inside. In the corridor, the fluorescent lights felt harsher after the sun. The noise felt louder. Aisha returned to her patients with her mind clearer than it had been in a long time. Over the next few weeks, Aisha started taking her break outside whenever weather allowed. Sometimes Maren joined her. Sometimes another co-worker did. The bench became a small anchor in the middle of a day that could otherwise blur into urgency. One afternoon, a younger nurse asked Aisha why she always went outside at lunch. Aisha thought of giving a practical answer: fresh air, vitamin D. Instead, she said, "Because it helps me remember I'm a person too." The younger nurse looked surprised, then nodded slowly. Aisha's work did not change. The hospital still demanded attention. People still arrived, frightened and in pain. But Aisha's relationship to attention shifted slightly. She stopped spending it all at once. She began to see that some minutes were not a luxury. They were the foundation that held the rest. By midwinter, the courtyard plants were bare and the bench was cold to the touch. But Aisha still sat there with her thermos and watched the daylight. The sparrow was gone, replaced by occasional crows. Maran would sometimes sit beside her and say nothing, and the nothing would feel steady. Some time earns its value because it is productive, because it helps someone else. Other time earns its value because it restores the person who is doing the helping. Aisha looked at the sun on the bricks and understood that her lunch break was not wasted time. It was time well spent, the kind that made the rest of the day possible. Gordon started walking in the mornings because his doctor suggested it, and because the house felt too quiet after his wife died. The doctor said movement was good for the heart. Gordon suspected the walking was also meant for the other kind of heaviness, the kind that settled in the chest even when the heart was fine. Gordon was 76 and had been married for 53 years. He and his wife, Lynn, had built a life around small routines: coffee at 7, crossword puzzles, Sunday phone calls with their daughter. After Lynn died, the routines remained like outlines with no person inside them. Gordon woke at 7 anyway and stared at the coffee maker as if it were waiting for instructions. His daughter called often. She lived a few hours away and offered to visit every weekend. Gordon told her not to make a burden of it. She said, "Dad, you are not a burden." Gordon heard the truth in her voice and still felt the old need to be sturdy. One morning, while walking around the park near his neighborhood, Gordon saw a small group of people moving at an easy pace, 6 or 7 of them, a loose circle that expanded and contracted as they talked. They were not wearing matching shirts. They were not counting steps. They looked like they belonged to the morning. A woman in the group noticed Gordon's slow lap and called out, "We walk here every day at 9 if you ever want company." Her name was Teresa. She said it as if it were an ordinary offer, not charity. Gordon nodded and said, "Maybe." He walked one more lap alone, then went home. The offer stayed with him longer than he expected, like a small note slipped into a pocket. The next day, Gordon returned at 9. The group was there again, laughing about something small. Teresa smiled when she saw him and said, "There you are." Gordon felt his face warm. He joined them. At first, Gordon did not say much. He listened to names and stories. One man talked about his grandkids. A woman talked about a new recipe she was trying. Someone mentioned a local road closure. The conversation moved like water, not demanding anything from Gordon. Teresa walked beside him for a while and asked about Lynn, not in a probing way, just a simple question: how long they had been married. Gordon answered and felt the familiar ache, but he also felt a relief at being able to speak her name out loud in a normal sentence. Over the next week, Gordon showed up again and again. The group became a small structure in the day. They did not become his best friends overnight. They became something quieter, familiar faces, shared weather, the small comfort of being expected. One morning, it rained lightly, and the park was empty. Gordon assumed the group would not come. Then, he saw Teresa under an umbrella, waiting. She waved him over. A couple of others arrived too, hats pulled down, jackets zipped. They walked anyway, slower, careful on wet pavement. Teresa said, "I figured if I didn't come, I'd regret it." Gordon laughed softly and said, "Me too." The laugh surprised him. It came out without effort. After the walk, Teresa offered to get coffee. Gordon hesitated, then agreed. They sat in a small cafe near the park. The place smelled like baked bread. Teresa talked about her sister, and Gordon talked about his daughter and the way she tried to fix everything. Teresa nodded and said, "That's love." Gordon looked down at his cup and let the sentence settle. When Gordon returned home, the house was still quiet. The difference was that the quiet did not feel as sharp. It felt like a place he could re-enter after being with people. He called his daughter and told her about the walking group. She sounded relieved. She said, "I'm glad." Gordon heard himself say, "Me too." As the weeks passed, Gordon's attention began to shift. He still missed Lynn. That did not change. What changed was where his hours went. Instead of dissolving into television and drifting thoughts, the morning held faces and names and the sound of shoes on gravel. The day had a beginning that felt lived. Some time is spent alone and still counts as good time. Some time is spent with others and becomes a gentle bridge back to the world. Gordon realized that the minutes he used to dismiss, a walk, a coffee, a conversation about nothing in particular, were often the minutes that made life feel real again. He put his walking shoes by the door and set his alarm for 8:45, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be there, ready for the next morning. Lydia realized she was tired of the television, not because the shows were bad, but because the noise followed her from room to room. It filled space that did not need to be filled. It made the house feel busy without making it feel alive. Lydia was 62 and lived with her husband, Sam, in a small ranch house they bought when their children were in elementary school. The children were grown now. One lived across town. One lived across the country. The bedrooms had become offices and storage rooms, the way houses quietly reassign themselves. Sam had retired the previous year. He was still adjusting. He tended to drift toward the couch, remote in hand, as if the remote were a tool for managing time. Lydia did not blame him. She had her own versions of drifting, scrolling through her phone, reading headlines that did not change anything, spending attention on things that evaporated. On a Friday evening in late fall, Lydia made pasta and set 2 plates on the table. Sam sat down and ate with appreciation. He talked about a neighbor's new fence and a minor annoyance with the lawnmower. Lydia listened and nodded and felt affectionate toward the smallness of the topics. Small topics meant their life was not on fire. After dinner, Sam reached for the remote. Lydia watched his hand and felt something in her chest tighten. Not anger, more like a quiet refusal forming. She said, "Could we not tonight?" Sam looked surprised. He asked if she was upset. Lydia shook her head and said, "I just want it quiet." Sam set the remote down. He stood and washed dishes, slower than usual, as if giving Lydia a chance to change her mind. Lydia did not change her mind. She wiped the counter and listened to the sound of water and plates and the occasional clink of silverware. The kitchen felt like a real room again. When the dishes were done, Sam said, "What do you want to do?" Lydia thought for a second. She remembered a stack of old CDs in a drawer, ones they used to play when the kids were young. She opened the drawer and found a jazz album Sam loved, the cover worn at the edges. She held it up and said, "This." Sam smiled, a real smile, and said he had not heard that in years. It took them a few minutes to find the old player and plug it in. Sam crouched behind the cabinet and muttered about dust. Lydia handed him a cloth and watched him work, amused by how focused he became, the way a small task could bring him back into the room. When the speakers finally hummed to life, Sam looked pleased, as if he had fixed something that mattered. They put the album on and sat in the living room without turning on the lamp, letting the light from the hallway spill in. The music started gently, a piano line that felt like someone walking across a room without waking anyone. At first, Lydia felt restless. She noticed her own mind reaching for distraction, for the next thing. Then she listened again, actually listened, and the restlessness eased. Sam leaned back and closed his eyes. Lydia watched his face and saw something soften there too. Halfway through the second track, Sam reached over and took Lydia's hand. He did it without looking at her, as if the music had reminded his body of an old habit. Lydia squeezed his fingers and felt a warmth rise, not dramatic, just steady. They talked a little between songs, not about anything urgent. Sam mentioned how his father used to play records on Saturday mornings. Lydia said her mother used to sing while folding laundry. They laughed quietly at a memory of their son dancing in the living room in socks, sliding too far and crashing into a chair. The laugh stayed in the room like a gentle echo. Later, Lydia's phone lit up with a message from their daughter across the country, a picture of a cat sitting in a cardboard box. Lydia smiled and showed Sam. Sam laughed and said the cat looked smug. Lydia sent back a quick reply and put the phone down again. When the album ended, the silence afterward felt different from the silence before. It was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that had been shaped by attention. Sam said, "We should do that more." Lydia nodded. She did not say, "We should have done that sooner." She did not need to. The truth was already in the room. Sometimes slips away because it is filled with easy noise. Sometimes stays because it is filled with presence, a meal, dishes washed, music played, a hand held without performance. Lydia looked at Sam and felt grateful that they still had nights like this, ordinary and unhurried. They turned off the last light and went to bed. The house was quiet. Lydia listened to Sam's breathing and thought simply, "This is enough." And in that thought, the day felt well spent. The days that stay with people are rarely the ones that look perfect from the outside. They are the days made of small, ordinary minutes, the ones that do not announce themselves. A cup set down on a table, a hand finding another hand without needing a reason, a room where the noise is turned off and the quiet is allowed to be gentle. It can take years to notice this, not because the truth is complicated, but because attention gets trained to chase what feels urgent, the clock, the list, the next message, the next task. And then one day, without warning, the mind pauses long enough to see what has been there all along. The best parts of life are often not the big events. They are the steady moments that hold people together and make a day feel lived. A short ride becomes a shared morning. A slow walk becomes a return to the world. A song played again becomes a doorway back into memory. A small kindness offered to a stranger becomes proof that the world is still made of people, not just schedules. Even grief and uncertainty, when they come, can be carried more softly when attention is not running away from them, but sitting beside them for a while, letting them be real without letting them take everything. And if you look back, The pattern is simple. Time well spent is time that leaves a person more human than they were at the start of the hour, more present, more connected, more able to notice warmth in a room, calm in a familiar voice, comfort in being close to someone, even in silence. There is no single perfect way to spend a day. Some days are noisy, some days are heavy, some are plain and almost forgettable. But in the middle of all of them, there are small chances to return to what matters, even briefly. A pause in a hallway, a shared cup of coffee, a quiet bench, a table where people sit long enough to let the moment arrive. Now the day can begin to settle, the way it always does in the end. In many houses, the lights are lower, the rooms are quieter. The air has a softer sound to it. A distant car passes and fades. A heater clicks and then rests. A ceiling fan turns with a slow, patient rhythm. The mind does what minds do, letting a few thoughts float up, then drift away again. What did not get finished today can remain unfinished. What did not get solved today can stay where it is, outside the door of this moment. Tomorrow will bring its own light, its own conversations, its own small choices. Tonight is only for easing, for letting the body become heavy in a safe place, for letting the mind loosen its grip. If any memory wants to linger, let it be one of the quiet ones. A shared laugh that did not need explaining, a familiar hand nearby, a small kindness that made the day feel softer. Let everything else fade to the edges, like the last color leaving the sky. The minutes keep moving, gentle and steady, whether anyone watches them or not. And in the calm of this late hour, it is enough to simply be here. The day has been lived. The night has arrived. The quiet can hold what remains as sleep comes, unhurried and kind.